Good afternoon, everybody. We are in the homeland of the Abenaki people. The Abenaki have been here since time immemorial and continue to be a thriving indigenous culture in this region. Lake Champlain Maritime Museum acknowledges with gratitude their generations of stewardship, past, present, and future. Welcome to our third annual virtual archaeology conference. My name is Sarah Yamaguchi, and I'm the public programs and volunteer manager here at the museum, and I'll be one of your hosts today. We're so excited that you could join us here for this conference, and we're super excited to share all of our team's latest work with you all. I'd like to briefly go over the structure of this webinar just to get everyone acquainted with the space before we jump into presentations today. So joining me here is Jack Mersick, who will be helping us out with all of our tech needs in this webinar. He's going to be monitoring the chat and making sure that everything goes smoothly. So if you have any questions for Jack regarding the technology today, feel free to contact him in the webinar chat using the icon at the bottom of your screen, and he can help you out with anything that you might need. We will have 4 presentations today from each of our wonderful archaeology team members, and there will be time for a short Q&A session in between each presentation where we can answer a couple of questions related to the presentation. Once all of the presentations have finished, we'll have time for a longer Q&A session at the end, so fear not if your question doesn't get answered right away. We'll do our very best to get to as many as we can today. If you look to the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a Q&A icon. This is where you can send us your questions as you think of them during the presentation. Feel free to send as many as you'd like whenever you think of them, and again, we'll do our best to get them answered. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our Executive Director, Chris Sabick, to get us started today.
Excuse me. Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Sabick. I'm the Executive Director of the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, and I'm happy to welcome you to our third annual virtual archaeology conference. We started this during the pandemic as an alternative to SHA when it was had gone all virtual as well, and it's been such an amazing success that we're really excited to be offering it for a third year and have such a great response. So thank you for attending. Wanted to start with just a little bit of background about the museum. Through all of our work, Lake Champlain Maritime Museum is connecting people to Lake Champlain, inspiring them to learn from the past, build together in the present, and to create a sustainable future for all of us and Lake Champlain. The museum is located on a 3-acre waterfront campus just outside of Vergennes, Vermont, on the eastern shore of Lake Champlain. We opened in 1985, and today we welcome about 10,000 students and visitors every year to experience our exhibits, our boat building and rowing programs, and our educational outreach programs. Our team also conducts new archaeological research, and stewards our collection of objects, research materials, and archives, along with the many well-preserved in situ cultural resources at the bottom of Lake Champlain. In 2 years, the United States will be commemorating the 250th anniversary of the events of 1776 in 2026. Our unique collections and research experience position us well to take a leading role throughout the region in these commemorations, including the work that you'll be hearing about today. The museum is community supported by hundreds of members who provide the financial support for us to be able to offer most of our programs for free or at reduced cost. Many of you joining us today are members already, and we'd love to thank you for that. Thank you very much for your support. For those of you that might like to become members, we actually have a special offer for you today. We're giving away this beautiful pewter ornament, which I'll attempt to show here, which we designed in collaboration with our friends at the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation, and it was produced by Danforth Pewter. This retails in our store for just shy of $30. So please consider joining as a member today and receive this special gift. Membership starts at $40, so it's practically a giveaway. That'd be $40 for individuals and $115 for family memberships. Your membership support makes all of our work possible. The link to become a member will be posted in the chat, so keep an eye out for that, and thank you for your support and for making all of our work possible. We open for the 2024 season on May 18th, so mark your calendars, and until then, we are offering virtual programs like the one you're experiencing today, and a digital museum visit experience on our website, where we hope you will visit as well. A little bit of background about the project. Today, our team and our partners are thrilled to share the research work happening right here on Lake Champlain and literally right in the museum's backyard in Arnold's Bay. While the events of 1776 may seem far in the past, I hope that these presentations will remind all of us how history is not set in stone, but rather it is a living document that can be completely re-understood by the discoveries that are made through archaeological and historical research. The things we are learning now shed light on the lived experiences of real people from the past. We often only learn the stories of the heroic victories and the men at the helm of these ships, but there were real people involved in all of it. And our goal is to help the public connect to the past through the stories of individuals. American history is not and was not preordained. History was made by individuals making decisions and taking action. And when people today make that connection, they start to see themselves as empowered history makers who have the ability to make their own decisions and to shape the future. Now, no proper introduction would be complete without a long list of thank yous, and I have a few here I'd like to go through real quick. First of all, thank you to our generous funders for these projects. That includes the National Park Service's American Battlefield Protection Program, who have been longtime partners of the Maritime Museum. We also have tremendous support from the Champlain Valley National Heritage Partnership, the Vermont Arts Council, Vermont Humanities, the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, Jeff and Susan Nelson, and many other donors who have supported our efforts over the years. We would also like to thank the Stockbridge Muncie Community Band of the Mohicans and the Abenaki community in Vermont for their partnership and support of this project. We have a very special thank you to our partners at the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation and the Navy History and Heritage Command, and specifically the Underwater Archaeology Branch of NHHC. Thank you to Dennis, Vicky, and Annie Hopper, who are the landowners that own the fields around Arnold's Bay, and they have been exceptionally generous in allowing us to access those lands and for supporting our efforts over the years. Thank you to the many individuals who have donated historic objects to the museum's collection related to this era and that we are truly studying. You'd be amazed at what people have in their homes, in their attics and basements related to our local history, and we are so grateful to them for coming to us and sharing that history. Thank you to artist and longtime friend of the museum, Ernie Haas. Ernie's incredible paintings allow us to visualize the maritime history of Lake Champlain, and you'll be seeing many of his works throughout the various presentations today. Of course, thank you to our many volunteers who dedicated their time and expertise to our research efforts. In 2023, this included, actually our entire team was made of current or previous interns, including Taylor Picard, Ian Shoemaker, and even my old grad school roommate and research partner, Eric Arnold. Thank you also to our LCMM team who is working behind the scenes to make today's virtual magic happen. Sarah Yamaguchi, Jack Mersick, Catherine Noiva, and Meg Salox. Thank you guys. We couldn't do this without you. And with that taken care of, let's transition to a brief look at the historic context for our presentations today, and as well as an overview of the Arnold's Bay project to date. And with that, I'll start sharing my presentation. Okay, here we go. The story of 1776 on Lake Champlain and the Battle of Lake Champlain is really about the control of the waterway, the nearly continuous waterway that stretches from the St. Lawrence River down to New York City. This consists of the Richelieu River, Lake Champlain, Lake George, and the upper headwaters of the Hudson River. Control of this water corridor through what in the 18th century was still virtually wilderness, was vitally important and acted as an avenue of invasion, both to the north when the Americans attempted to invade Canada in 1775, and of course in 1776 when the British came down from Canada to invade and control Lake Champlain. After the defeat of the American invasion into Canada in 1775 in the early winter of 1776, American forces retreated to the very southern end of the lake at Skeensboro, which is present-day Whitehall, New York, and there they set up a shipyard and started to construct vessels to defend Lake Champlain from the impending British invasion. The majority of the American forces settled at Fort Ticonderoga, just a few miles north of Skenesboro, and set up defensive positions there. The Americans had captured a number of small vessels, most of these sloops and schooners, in 1775, and those formed the core of a fleet on Lake Champlain. But they very quickly set about building additional vessels for the fleet. This included 8 of the the gondolas or gunboats. These were 54-foot long vessels, 15 feet wide, that carried 3 guns and were mostly maneuvered by oars. They did it, frankly, not the world's best fighting platform. So at some point they decided to increase the production of larger vessels like this one here on the right. Those are the row galleys, which by the time of the Battle of Valcour Island, they had produced 3 of these. And this is going to be the centerpiece of some of our discussions today. In total, by the time late summer rolled around in 1776, the Americans had assembled a fleet of about 15 vessels. And during that whole time, the British were doing the same thing up at Fort St. John at the northern end of the lake, where they were also constructing a fleet of sailing vessels and rowed gunboats as well to, hopefully capture Lake Champlain in 1776. These 2 fleets finally came to grips with one another on October 11th of 1776 at the Battle of Valcour Bay. Fighting commenced, Benedict Arnold had positioned the American fleet between Valcour Island and the New York shore in a very clever location, which forced the British Royal Navy fleet that was coming from the north to actually sail past the island and then attempt to come up into the wind to come to grips with the American fleet. And frankly, several of their largest vessels were never able to make it up into the wind and participate in the battle. Fighting started mid-morning on October 11th and lasted until nightfall. There were certainly casualties and damage on both sides, though I think it's fair to say that the American fleet was taking the worst of the punishment. They had lost at least 50 sailors killed, and were running low on ammunition and shot for their armament. As night fell, the British fleet retreated and set up a blockade stretching from the southern tip of Valcour Island over to the New York shore, or at least they thought they set up a blockade there. As night fell, we have the sinking of one of the gunboats. The gunboat Philadelphia sank due to being hit by a 24-pound cannonball right up in the bow of the vessel. As you may know, this vessel, the Philadelphia, was recovered in 1935 and is now on display at the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. And it is currently a very active research subject. The vessel is being reconserved and re-examined in very great detail by our friends at the Smithsonian, in collaboration with Texas A&M University. So they're doing some really amazing work, and I highly recommend you follow along with that project on the National Museum of American History's website. Also, so that as night fell, the Americans were actually able to escape through the British lines by lining their vessels up single file and putting a lantern in the stern of each vessel so it could only be seen from the back. And arranged in that manner, they snuck through the British line and fled south. Now, they may have been aided in this by a tremendous distraction that was happening at the southern tip of Valcour Island, and that was the burning of one of the American vessels, the schooner Royal Savage, which was set alight in the evening so that it wouldn't be reused by either side, frankly, during the expected conflict to continue in the morning. But undoubtedly, this enormous fire and the related explosions to it probably provided a great distraction for the escape of the American fleet. Now, this is also a vessel, or the remains of this vessel were also recovered from the lake in the 1930s, and is currently a research subject at Navy History and Heritage Command down on the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. So again, follow along with their project for upcoming and new and exciting research on the Royal Savage itself. As they fled south in the night of October 11th, the colonial fleet made a brief stop near Schuyler Island, which is just a few miles south of the battle site. Here they took the opportunity to patch holes, fix their rigging, and get themselves prepared for the longer journey south. At this time, they determined that 2 of the gunboats were no longer viable and had to be abandoned. That would be the gunboat Jersey and the gunboat Spitfire. Jersey, they attempted to sink to deny its capture to the British, but it was found the following morning by the British fleet just swamped at the water surface. Spitfire, which we see here in this Ernie Haas painting, was successfully sunk and now rests in the deep water of Lake Champlain, where it was recently the subject of a photogrammetry survey in 2022. With the assistance of Kotaro Yamafune, we were able to produce this amazing 3-dimensional model of the Spitfire as it rests on the bottom of Lake Champlain. During the day of October 12th, the American fleet continued to head south, and the British followed them several miles north of the American fleet. By the morning of October 13th, the American fleet had started to get pretty stretched out and straggly. A number of the better sailing vessels, mostly these small merchant ships that had been pressed into the American fleet in 1775, as well as one of the row galleys and one of the gunboats, actually made better time and had pulled ahead of the rest of the fleet, and they made good their escape. That left the row galley Congress, the row galley Washington, and 4 gunboats kind of at the back of the fleet, making their way south, hopefully to protection. The British were able to catch up to them on the morning of October 13th, and a new running gun battle ensued. Very quickly, the row galley Washington was forced to strike its colors because it was very badly damaged at Valcour, and the captain of the vessel was, pretty convinced that his vessel would actually shake apart if he returned fire to the British fleet as they approached. So he was forced to strike his colors and surrender his vessel. This left Arnold on the Congress with 4 gunboats to fight off the remains of what was the better sailing vessels from the British fleet. This run and gun battle lasted about 2 hours, 2.5 hours, as they made their flight south from around Split Rock Mountain, and ultimately made their way into a small bay on the eastern shore of Lake Champlain that was then known as Ferris's Bay. Ferris's Bay was the location of a homesteading family. The Ferris family lived right on the shores of this small bay on Lake Champlain. And Arnold was familiar with this bay and the Ferris family, and he knew that it was a good place for him to tuck the fleet in. And hopefully he was looking to have the time to run the boats ashore, set them on fire, and destroy them before they could be captured by the British. At this point, it was clear they weren't going to make it all the way to Fort Ticonderoga before the British pummeled them into oblivion, and so it was better to deny the capture of these vessels by burning them. So they ran the boats ashore. They were set alight. The American crew and soldiers escaped off the vessels, carrying what they could, up a pretty steep bluff, about a 30-foot bluff at the back of Ferris's Bay, where they set up a temporary defensive line to repel any attempts by British troops to extinguish the fires on the vessels and capture them. They wanted to make sure that those vessels were fully engaged before they left, and that there was no hope of them being captured by the British and used by them. Once they were convinced that the vessels were fully engaged and were going to be destroyed, they gathered up their remaining troops, sailors, and the Ferris family, who were well-known rebel supporters, and they headed south about 12 miles to Crown Point, and then ultimately onto Fort Ticonderoga. In the years after the battle, or actually shortly after the battle, at the end of October, the British actually returned to what they termed Destruction Bay, because the carnage that they found when they returned to Ferris's Bay and the burned out hulks were still there. They spent some time recovering cannon and other material from those burned out hulks. They actually buried some of the bodies that they found floating along the shoreline. And these vessels continued to be visible on low water events throughout the 19th century. And there continued to be people picking pieces off of them, attempting to recover them. We know that three of the four gunboats that were burned in Ferris's Bay, which ultimately became known as Arnold's Bay, were recovered and have just been lost to history. The stern of the Roe Galley Congress was pulled out of the lake in 1891 and displayed on the shoreline for a short time before it was moved down to the hotel that is now the Chimney Point Historical Site down by the Champlain Bridge. And this, the only thing that survives, unfortunately, of that stern section of the Congress, other than that wonderful photograph, are two of the floors that were picked off the rotting remains, and luckily those have come to us at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum and are on display here now. In 1952, Lorenzo Haglund, the same gentleman who had recovered the Royal Savage and the Philadelphia from the Valcour battle site, came to Arnold's Bay and recovered the last of the gunboats, the fourth gunboat. This vessel was raised and floated over to the New York shore, where it was sunk for a couple of years, and then recovered and put on display at the mouth of the Ausable River on the New York shore of Lake Champlain. Haglund had hoped that a maritime museum would be built into which this wreck and a couple of others that he had recovered could be put on display, but sadly that museum never materialized, and eventually this gunboat that was recovered in 1952 rotted away to the point where there's very little left of it at this point. And there is sadly a KOA campground on this site now and no remains of the vessel there. In the 1960s, a group called, led by Bill Leege, came to Arnold's Bay and was able to relocate the remains of the Congress and carried out some avocational archaeology excavations on the site, recovered an amazing collection of artifacts, and this is going to be the subject of the next presentation by Patricia Reid. In the 1980s, the remains of the Congress were relocated one more time. I believe it was 1984. And some initial excavation was done there just to confirm that that's what the timbers that they had identified were. This was followed in 1988 by the excavations at the Ferris homestead itself. That cliff face the bluff that I had mentioned at the back of what's now known as Arnold's Bay, you can see in this picture here, is pretty steep, and that it had continued to retreat into the farm fields, and the cellar hole from the Ferris's homestead was starting to fall into the lake. So this rescue kind of archaeology situation took place in 1988, where that was documented thoroughly. In the process, they did find a number of pieces of iron shot, which corresponded to the historical accounts of the Ferris homestead being hit a number of times during the actions on October 13th. In 2001, Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, with some Department of Defense legacy funding, spent some time in Arnold's Bay, again relocating the Congress timbers and doing a survey of the bottom to see if any other structures remained from the other gunboats that were burned there. And while they found a lot of loose timbers around, the big feature that was found was the remains of the Congress, which you can see very clearly right here, right? That this sticking out of the mud here is obviously part of a row galley from 1776. In addition to this plank sticking out, though, there are a number of little frame tips that were found sticking up out of the mud. And it was this map that was created from 2001 that we utilized when we started our project to relocate the remains of the Congress. In addition to these couple of timbers that are sticking out of the mud, there are two pretty distinct and unusual piles of ballast stones that help to delineate and identify the Congress site. So in 2020, we received a grant award from the American Battlefield Protection Program to gain a better understanding of the Arnold's Bay battlefield. And to that end, we started work in 2021 doing metal detector surveys of not only the in-water portion of the battlefield, but also the shoreline and the farm fields surrounding Arnold's Bay. And for the terrestrial work there, we worked with the Advanced Metal Detecting for the Archaeology group, who came and presented a weekend-long workshop that was to train archaeologists in how to incorporate metal detecting into their research design. And for this type of fairly large scale survey, it was absolutely instrumental and the ideal technological component to use for our survey work. We had a class of about 25 people that joined us for the long weekend to survey, again, as I mentioned, the shoreline, the transitional zone, and these regions of the farm fields that are highlighted with these pink polygons. Including one that's over here next to where the first homestead site was located. In 2021, we also did some limited in-water metal detecting along transects that were arranged around the identified hull remains of the Royal Galley Congress. In 2022, we greatly expanded the area that we were working on in water with the metal detecting, and had a team there for the entire month of August, doing a lot of metal detecting, and recovered, several hundred artifacts from these transects, which again are arranged around the Congress's hull remains, which are indicated here by this yellow box. In the fall of 2022, we had the opportunity, we received our permit from Navy History and Heritage Command to carry out some excavations on the hull remains of the Congress. And we only had limited time in 2022 because we were approaching the end of the season, but we were able to excavate one trench across the hull remains that we found. And of course, discussion of the artifacts from the metal detecting survey will be coming up in a presentation by Cherilyn Gilligan. And I will be discussing in more detail the remains of the Congress in my full presentation, and Paul Gates will be discussing the site formation processes that we've identified that helped form the site that we see today. We'll get into some more detail about all of those things moving forward. So that's our historic background and project summary. I'm going to transition on to Patricia Reid and allow her to present on the Bill Leege-led excavations in the 1960s and the artifacts that were found during that survey. Stop sharing and take it away, Patricia.
And start sharing. Thank you so much, Chris. Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for that introduction. Welcome to today's conference. Now that we have a bit of historical background on the events of the Battle of Lake Champlain, as well as the history of the site at Arnold's Bay, my talk today will focus on the excavations at the Congress site led by William Leege in 1960 and 1961, and the artifact collection from those excavations, which are housed here at the museum. So I wanted to start with an overview of what I'll be talking about today. First, I'll define some of the language you'll hear throughout today's conference and talk briefly about the state and federal laws that protect Arnold's Bay and other archaeological sites. I'll talk about Bill and his team, their project goals, and the methodology for their excavations, as well as give an overview of the artifact collections from those excavations. Then I want to talk a bit about comparative collections. One of the most interesting parts of our recent work is to compare what we are uncovering from Arnold's Bay today to objects from existing collections and those from other institutions. I'll give a few examples of how pieces from the Leege collection have informed our current research. And as you'll see in all of today's presentations, there'll be a brief period for questions and answers at the end of my talk. All right, so as all of you were registering, you probably read a bit about our presentations and the big themes of the conference. So I wanted to start by addressing one of those first questions. What can we learn from sites that were previously looted or previously excavated by avocational archaeologists? There are, of course, many different descriptive words that we can attribute to people who have interacted with an archaeological site. Some of them, like looting, salvaging, or relic hunting, evoke a negative image, while others, such as avocational archaeologist or researcher, have a more positive slant. In short, the difference between looting and avocational archaeology depends on whether the person uses a clear, documented, and systemic method in excavating or in any way disturbing an archaeological site. Today, thanks to federal and state laws that protect sites, any investigations also require folks to develop and follow research designs, receive permits, and submit reports on their findings. Chris talked a bit about that a moment ago. All of that said, we know that many people, especially folks who have long ties to the area, have items in their homes that were found by parents, grandparents, or others. And while these materials don't have the information that comes from keeping them in their original archaeological context, there's still so much we can learn from those items, and those items do make excellent donations to museum collections. That said, I want to be very clear that the excavations conducted by Bill Leege and his crew in 1960 and 1961 definitely fall into the category of avocational archaeology. As I'll discuss shortly, his team conducted a great deal of historic research prior to the excavations, and they documented the project's operations through photography, dive logs, drawings, and daily summaries. Equally importantly, Bill and his team had good intentions. Their goal was to document and preserve this historic shipwreck. And later, he donated almost all of the artifact collection and research materials to both the museum and the Clinton County Historical Association, which means we can continue to use his team's work for research, exhibits, and programming going forward. It's also important that Bill's work happened before federal and state laws that protect archaeological sites went into effect. As you might guess from the dates of the laws on this slide, archaeology as a science is a relatively new field. It wasn't until several decades ago that researchers began to consider the context in which an artifact was found just as important as the object itself. Now, when I say context, I mean the exact location where it was discovered, the other artifacts and site features around it, and the chronological, historical, and cultural resources associated with it. Today, archaeological sites are protected by these laws, which require teams to seek permits and submit reports on their findings. Because the Congress was a naval vessel, it's under the Navy's jurisdiction, and as Chris mentioned, we did receive a permit from the U.S. Navy History and Heritage Command to conduct excavations at the Congress site in 2022 and 2023. These same laws prohibit the public today from disturbing, looting, or vandalizing archaeological sites. In the state of Vermont, this does include metal detecting on public land or private land without the permission of the landowner. Penalties can range from fines to prison time. And removing artifacts from a site also strips them of their archaeological context. As we'll learn in Cher's talk later this afternoon, context is the most important aspect of an artifact, feature, or site. So PSA, please, please don't move artifacts from where they're found. If you come across an artifact or a site, the most helpful thing you can do is photograph and document the artifacts where you found them, and share those photos and information with the museum or the State Historic Preservation Office. Every state has one. And if you find materials associated with Native people, you can also contact the appropriate Tribal Historic Preservation Office. If you don't know who to contact or how to reach them, please contact us and we'll put you in touch. All right, now that I've gone through the rules and regulations, let's talk a bit about Bill Leege and his team, their project goals, and their methodology. We don't have a picture of the full team, so I've included a picture of Bill working on the Valcour Bay Research Project in 2001 here. These excavations were led by Bill, who's had a lifelong love for Lake Champlain's history and from a young age was fascinated by historic documents. He told Chris and I plenty of stories about spending hours at his mentor's house, Hugh and Malcolm McClellan, who had hundreds of archival documents relating to the 18th century. That collection is now in SUNY Plattsburgh Special Collections, by the way. Those experiences shaped Bill's interest in our local history and eventually culminated in excavations at Arnold's Bay, Plattsburgh Bay, Cumberland Head, and other sites throughout the lake. Bill's wife, Beverly, was also an important team member. Before the excavations began in 1960, Bill and Beverly traveled to Washington, D.C., where they spent several days researching in the archives at the Smithsonian. Beverly transcribed many archival documents related to the Battle of Lake Champlain. And these transcriptions, as well as Bill's research notes and field logs from the project, are currently in the process of being donated to the Clinton County Historical Association in Plattsburgh. Another team member was Bob Leahy, Bill's fellow diver and brother-in-law, who searched for and excavated the Congress remains alongside Bill in both 1960 and 1961. And finally, they were joined by their friend and fellow historian, Oscar Brendenberg, who processed artifacts on board a small boat as the excavations proceeded. Brendenberg's papers collection is now in the archives of the Bixby Memorial Free Library in Virginia. Okay, so in short, the team's project goals were simple. Number 1, to locate the remains of the Congress, and then to excavate its ship's timbers and remove its artifact collection. As Chris mentioned earlier, there were 4 other gunboats which burned in the bay on October 13th, 1776, which would have been the Connecticut, Providence, New Haven, and Boston. Over the years, folks had pulled these remains out of the bay, and by 1960, there were none left. Bill and his team also hoped to identify the locations where these gunboats burned. They thought they might find clusters of artifacts in the bay to mark where the gunboats had been. However, that proved as difficult for Bill in the 1960s as it has for us in recent years, and the team only ended up locating the Congress remains. Dive work in total took place over 2 weeks in 1960 and 1961, specifically August 23rd to the 31st, 1960, and August 2nd to the 6th, 1961. The main activity in 1960 was locating the Congress remains. As part of the search, Bill recalled talking with a certain Captain Scion, an eccentric man then in his 80s, who was living in a tent platform at the bay and had previously operated a sail ferry from Arnold's Bay to Westport, New York. You can see here an image of Captain Scion's ferry, which is in Bixby Library's collection in Vergennes. Captain Scion was well aware of the location of the Congress. He told Bill a vivid story of hooking up his boat to the remains, waiting until the Ticonderoga had passed by, and then using its wake to dislodge timbers. He would use those timbers to reshape them into canes or other objects, like this 1872 cane pictured here, which is currently on display in our exhibit about the Battle of Lake Champlain. He encouraged Bill and his team to look for the remains in the northern half of the bay. And between their conversations with Captain Scion and a few days scanning the areas with metal detectors, Bill and his team relocated one exposed rib of the Congress on August 26, 1960. They spent the final 2 days of the 1960 dive season metal detecting over these timbers and unearthing several artifacts. This map, produced by William Bayreuther as part of his 1984 report on the Leege excavations, shows where the team believes the wreck was located, and as you'll see in later presentations, matches up well with where our current excavations have been focused. We believe that our 2023 dive season exposed many of the same timbers that Bill and his team worked on in the 1960s, and possibly a few more. So the 1961 excavations then featured dredging rather than metal detecting. And Bill, when he talks about it, refers to the dredge as a mudsucker, which for those of you on this webinar who are unfamiliar with the term, does conjure up a somewhat accurate picture of what it does. Bob and Bill used a 4-inch dredge to start, which created a bit too much suction to work with, and they modified the machine over the course of the week to avoid clogs from branches and other debris as they worked. Visibility in the bay in the 1960s, before the infestation of zebra mussels in the 1990s, was even poorer than it is now, so Bill and Bob would have been working in nearly blackout conditions. But over the course of the week, they exposed at least 3 ribs of what they considered to be the bow of the Congress, which you can see in the image on this screen. Oscar was stationed on board a small boat above the dive site, and he sifted the artifacts as they came up through the dredge, as you can see in this image. Smaller pieces were sucked up the dredge to be sifted. Some larger pieces and fragile artifacts, particularly larger ceramic and glass materials, were spotted despite the poor visibility in the bay and kept from going up the dredge. In addition to the dive log, Bill and his team kept lists of the artifacts as they were recovered from the dive operations. Bill later numbered the artifacts from Arnold Bay with an AB tag, as you can see here. And in the early 1980s, Dr. Kevin Chrisman from Texas A&M University, along with 2 others, Mary Margaret Zach and William Bayreuther, visited Bill's collection to inventory, draw, and photograph what was recovered. Bill and his team were careful to document their work throughout the process, which has been invaluable for the museum as we continue to care for those artifacts here. Now, over 400 artifacts were recovered during the 1960 and 1961 excavations at Arnold's Bay. Bill kept them in his possession for several decades, along with thousands of other artifacts he recovered from Plattsburgh Bay, Cumberland Head, and other sites around the lake. Together with other interested historians and divers in the area, Bill formed the Lake Champlain Archaeological Associates, or LCAA, in 1982, and together they cared for Bill's artifact collection. As the organization became less active in the 1990s, LCAA donated this collection to our museum. Because these artifacts are associated with naval sites, the museum later transferred ownership of these materials to the U.S. Navy. But as we are still the repository for this important collection, they're still housed here. In 2023, we re-inventoried all of these nearly 3,000 artifacts that comprise the LCAA collection. And during this inventory, we regrouped Leege's 400 plus Arnold's Bay collection pieces into 223 artifact lots. These pieces included wood and stoneworking tools like the adze head and chisels on the left, as well as personal armament like this fragment of a short sword handle and this musket trigger guard tail, which I'll talk more about in a bit. When we look at a breakdown of the artifacts by material type, iron is far and away the most common. We also have a decent number of bone and wood pieces, as well as some ceramic, glass, lead, organic, and cupreous, that means brass or copper, artifacts. I'll show some images in each category on the following slides. Okay, the iron artifacts mostly broke down into three categories: tools like the adze head that I showed earlier, plenty of fasteners, and shot. The collection has 36 spikes, 47 nails, 41 nail and spike fragments, and nearly 100 pieces of shot, mostly grape and canister shot. Cupreous artifacts are mostly associated with firearms, including the trigger guard that I showed a moment ago, as well as some buttons, cufflinks, and a quill holder I'll talk about in a little while. Wooden pieces are mostly made up of the vessel's rigging, like sheaves and blocks, and small fragments. There was one fragment of a bottle cork recovered, which is shown on the right. And Leege's team also recovered 8 ceramic fragments, mostly from plates and bowls, and 1 blue transferware teacup base, which is pictured here. All right, here's an example of a glass piece found during the Leege collections. These two pieces do actually fit together, and thanks to a colleague at Fort Ticonderoga, Margaret Stoddard, we think this might be a pocket bottle, which were used for easier transport in bags and coats due to their slightly flattened shape. This piece on the right from the Art Institute of Chicago shows what a complete pocket bottle would have looked like. Bottles like these were produced just before the Revolution and would have dated from 1769 to 1774. Okay, I'm going to finish my brief presentation by giving you all a few examples of how we've used pieces in this collection to answer questions about our current research. As the team was working on the Congress remains recently, and in the 1960s, we recovered wood chips from between the frames of the lower hull structure. We assumed these were debris from the vessel's construction. There was also evidence of tool marks on some of the surfaces of the uncovered hull timbers. We know that the final shaping of frame timbers, which was often done with an adze, pictured here. Adzes are a tool similar to axes. And adze would have produced wood chips and the markings we see on the Congress remains. Bill's team recovered this adze during the 1961 excavation. And while we can never say that this particular adze made those chips and markings, we can be confident that it would have been a similar tool. As another example, in 2022, the museum's team located the well-preserved brass inkwell you see on the right of my screen. Without readily available reference information on 18th century inkwells for comparison, we turned to this very similar inkwell and pen, or quill holder, recovered from the Congress in 1961. At first, we were puzzled by the glass fragment inside the 2022 inkwell, but the Leege collection showed us that these pieces were made with a glass insert to keep the ink contained. We've also seen similar pieces thanks to our friends at Fort Ticonderoga, which confirmed that this 2022 piece dates to the 18th century and may have come from the cabin of the Congress. Okay, and as a final example, this brass musket trigger guard tail. We knew it was part of the trigger guard system, or meaning it was part of the gun's hardware, but we didn't have a good sense of how to date it. Last week, Chris, Cher, and I met with Dr. Matt Kegel and Margaret Stoddard from Fort Ticonderoga. Matt has deep expertise in historic firearms, and thanks to him, we were able to match the piece Leege recovered closely to this musket, which dates to around 1710. We know that the colonial forces didn't see a large influx in arms until 1777, when the French began sending supplies. So it makes sense that this musket guard would have belonged to an older musket, probably a personal weapon that the soldier who owned it brought with him to service. And as you'll see in many examples throughout today's conference, this trigger guard tail is another example of how the colonial fleet at the Battle of Lake Champlain was full of people using what they had. Even if it was old or out of date, they made the most of whatever they had available. The Leege collection presents an excellent research opportunity, and it's an even better research opportunity when people have easy access to information about it. Our team has been working over the past several years to increase online access to collections to that end. Right now, the URL on this slide will take you to a landing page where you can explore basic information about our most commonly accessed collections. We have been collecting objects, archaeological research documentation, and archives related to the history of the Champlain Valley for nearly 40 years, and we're still collecting today, so there's a lot to go through. But we're currently in the process of a multi-year inventory to catalog all of our collections, both objects and archives. And as we continue that work, we'll be preparing to launch an online collections portal so that the public and researchers can access our database free of charge. More is coming soon, and I look forward to sharing more on the progress of this project in the near future. And that summarizes my presentation for today. I'm happy to take some questions now, and I'll also have some time at the end of the conference with the whole team. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing your presentation with us, Patricia. We do have time for one question before we head into the next presentation. So Robert asks, were the bone fragments recovered from the Leege collection human or animal? How do you account for them?
That's a very good question. Those fragments are all animal, not human. If they were, it would require a much more complicated and in-depth process for permitting with some of those agencies that I mentioned earlier. All of the fragments that we have here are animal remains, to my knowledge.
Awesome, thank you. And for everyone who is asking more questions, rest assured we will try to get to as many as we can in the final wrap-up Q&A session at the end of this webinar. So thank you very much, Patricia. Our next presentation is coming from Cherilyn Gilligan, our Assistant Director of Archaeology, who will be presenting on artifacts and their context. So take it away.
Hello everyone, and thanks for tuning in with us today. First, I'm going to give a quick reiteration of the bones of the Arnold's Bay project, and then I'm going to be talking a bit about archaeological processes, a bit about sampling, the importance of context, and more generally about how archaeologists use systematic investigations and theoretically based interpretations to answer our research questions. And I will try to make that more interesting than that probably just sounded. I'm going to use our musket ball sample as a case study for most of this, and then I'll go on to talk a bit about conservation and interpretation of some of the objects we have found during the Arnold's Bay project. In 2020, the museum was awarded a National Park Service American Battlefield Protection Program grant to survey the battlefield site in Arnold's Bay. The overall project was carried out in collaboration with Stockbridge-Munsee community and Abenaki leaders and members, and the museum also partnered with the Advanced Metal Detecting for the Archaeologist Group, or AMDA, as you will hear me reference. We partnered with them in 2021 for a terrestrial course in metal detection along the shoreline and the farm fields that border the bay. We had permission from the private landowners for the terrestrial class, we had Vermont state permits to access the bottomlands of the bay, and we worked under permit from Naval History and Heritage Command to be able to access the Galley Congress, which are the only remains of a vessel left in the bay. Under MOUs from both the state of Vermont and the Navy, the museum will serve as a repository for these collections, and once we're finished conserving these artifacts, the collections will be made available to the public for research. In 2021 and 2022, we investigated the bottomlands of the bay by laying underwater transects and using metal detectors along those lines. At the end of the 2022 season, we used an induction dredge to investigate a single trench across the remains of Congress, and the National Park Service grant work was brought to a close. In 2023, we were able to continue our work on Congress through a wonderful gift of a private donor, and we were also able to lay 2 more underwater transects. Now, when we start investigating a site archaeologically, we are generally looking at samples of the site. It is very rare that an archaeological site, especially one as large as this, would be completely 100% excavated. Firstly, I think such a feat would be almost impossible, but generally speaking, different projects use different sampling techniques, and these can vary depending on the type of the project scale, and the questions that you're asking. We create research designs and then choose techniques that help us answer those questions. Also, leaving portions of sites untouched allows space for new research and for the use of new technologies in the field. So for our project here, you can see outlines of the areas that we sampled for the terrestrial survey in Arnold's Bay. We wanted to look at chunks of the farmland that would have been the quickest escape routes for soldiers as they ran to shore from these boats under British fire. We also wanted to look past the Ferris homestead, as there were historic records of shots fired in that direction from the mouth of the bay. And we also wanted to test along this shoreline or transitional area below the bluff here. And you can see in this historic drawing the bluff that I'm referring to, and this wraps around the whole bay. And then along this transition zone here in yellow, we were really lucky to have low water levels at that time, so we were able to test further into the bay than we would have been able to reach otherwise. This past season, there was barely a beach visible all season, so luck was on our side that year while we were gathering these data with our AMDA course. Here you can see the transects that we ran underwater over the course of the project, and the remains of Congress, which we investigated at the end. That's that yellow box in the center of that cluster. So this sampling process was a bit different. We sort of spread out around the known ship remains and continued reaching out in all directions, so sort of a circle survey, but with linear transects running roughly north to south. This past season, we switched that up and we placed some transects east to west in order to see if we were still seeing materials further west than we had been able to investigate before, and also to test through an area that looked much less dense than the rest, that we had theorized may have been one of the locations of one of the burned gunboats. So now we're going to consider the spread of musket balls across this site, on land and underwater. For the terrestrial AMDA survey, a total of 276 artifacts were cataloged. Of that number, we have positive time period identification for 131 of those artifacts, which is that blue section on the right of this graph. And that's about roughly half. Keeping in mind, we're looking at data from an agricultural setting, a plow zone to be specific. And this is already a disturbed context, but we're basically looking for presence or absence of shot scattered here, and potentially the location of a line of defense, which might have been indicated by a particularly dense artifact cluster in the surrounding fields. So trying to interpret these finds in terms of evidence of soldiers in this field and pertaining to the battle that took place here. Of those 131 identified time period objects we found, we can take out some more noise. Of that blue section of identified objects, now you can see how they break down. 103 objects from this pool were nails, along with 2 examples of agricultural tool fragments. So if we take those objects out, then we're left with a sample of 28 time period objects relating to this battlefield, which is only 10% of the overall number of cataloged objects collected from the terrestrial survey. And now we're just looking at the musket balls, of which there were 12 found from the terrestrial survey. And I wanted to break this down again to just underline the fact that this is a small sample of a sample. And you can see the majority of those 12 musket balls clustered in this area of shoreline just east of the remains of Congress, which is a potential main route of exit of these boats by the soldiers, judging by the amounts of personal items that we found here, which included dropped shot, like you're seeing, and other objects like a bayonet scabbard hook and a lead jaws pad. For the underwater survey, there was a total of 1,102 cataloged artifacts. Of that number, we had a positive time period identification for 911 objects. Again, that's this blue section of the graph. And this is a much larger sample. That's about 83% of the total. And this is a much different setting, obviously. So we have less intrusion of modern materials in this collection, but I should point out that our methodologies were a little bit different between the 2 surveys. We cataloged all materials from the AMDA survey as it was part of a class, and I did identification later. For the underwater materials, I was cataloging as we went. So I was not giving modern debris catalog numbers unless they were unidentified in the fields. And then so those objects in the catalog, I was able to take into the lab and identify later on. So of our 911 time period objects, we had 363 musket balls. So that's about 40% of the time period material here. And you can see that's also a breakdown of the other time period materials in that blue section. So the musket balls make up a pretty big chunk of this collection. And then if we zoom in a bit here, now you can see that artifact scatter a little bit clearer. You might remember from past presentations, which I encourage you to check out on our YouTube channel, that there are some negative data here to the south of this longer transect. This is something that we've been theorizing about being a burned gunboat location. And we found melted lead there, which is not mapped on the image, but you can see that example in the top left of this slide. And then we have this super dense area to the north of these transects, nearer to the shoreline, which is another bit that we've been theorizing about, whether this could have been dumped from the Congress remains when that chunk was pulled out in the 1890s. And in that area, we found all kinds of personal items as well. Things that would have been in a boat cabin, for instance, like this brass inkwell from the bottom left, silverware like the fork on the right, and a hinge from a folding ruler towards the bottom of this slide. And finally, from our last season of work, we placed this perpendicular transect out towards the west of the site to see if we were still finding time period materials. And as you can see, we certainly were. In less density for sure, but still time period materials coming out here. And again, something like a musket ball by itself is just that. But that ball, as part of a collection with context, can tell us all kinds of interesting details, which we're going to look at now. So now we're going to pull these two collections of musket balls together and look at this as our new sample. So that is the 12 from the AMDA survey and the 363 from the underwater survey, which includes the work on Congress. So we have a total of 375 musket balls to look at from this site. And now we can start looking at different kinds of details like manufacturing techniques, wear marks, what kinds of guns would have used these ammunitions. And we can even take musket balls that have seen impact and determine their original caliber, which is a study I hope to do in the future, potentially with one of our AMDA partners, Joel Bowie. Details like attached sprues or misaligned casting leans us towards these being civilian made, very likely American made shot rather than imported. Here you can see examples for molds of shot here. These examples are from Fort Ticonderoga's collections, and you can see that bottom mold folded up at the bottom. Then at the top right, you can see a musket ball from that lineup that still has the sprue attached. So basically you would fold your mold in half, pour in your molten lead, and when it was cooled, you'd pop these out and trim the excess off, or trim that sprue off. And that one still has it attached up at the top. Underneath there in the middle is trimmed off bit of sprue. In that bottom image, you can see a clipped sprue casting pretty clearly. I have finally been able to crunch some data about the caliber for this shot as well, or the diameter range of the musket ball collection. And again, these data are for the entire musket ball collection from the whole site. So those 375 pieces, I had to pull out 29 that were too impacted to get a good diameter measurement. So that leaves us with 346 pieces seen here. And you can see, obviously, our really high peak there. And then here you can see that range divided by the kinds of gun that could use each caliber. And you can see where that peak lies with smoothbore muskets like French guns that we will see, and even fowling pieces. And I've arranged these graphs to mimic the study that Daniel Sivelich does in his 2016 guide on musket ball and small shot identification, which is an awesome resource. Something to keep in mind here is windage. So windage is the difference between the gun caliber and the ball diameter. And according to Sivelich and their sources, windage for military smoothbore muskets is about 0.05 to 0.10 inches. So I removed those 29 musket balls for being impacted or oblong to the point of being over 0.05 inches in difference of diameter. A few of our team made it over to Fort Ticonderoga just recently to compare some of our musket furniture to their collection and see if we could make some distinctions and connections with the guns, with the ammunition that we were finding. And this was really interesting to see, and I think Patricia has probably mentioned some of this, but we brought some pieces from the Leege collection with us as well. 2 fragmented trigger guard examples and the 1 trigger guard fragment that came from our latest field season. And we certainly narrowed down some of the options for these. We ruled out British carbines and some of the more refined sea service style muskets. And we sort of settled on these English contract arms that would have been big production pieces. And these would have been in the colonies before 1776. And the Queen Anne or pre-ordnance land service muskets, which were made before these more systematic productions. So made before in like the 1710s even. And this sort of makes the most sense. This is an example of a Fowler type gun on the right here. And then the one on the left, you can see our comparative pieces to Fort Ticonderoga's collections. And then these are some examples of those Queen Anne types. These pieces are on display at Fort Ticonderoga. And this one on the right is a sort of Frankenstein together piece. It has French and British parts, and they're a mixture of earlier and later pieces. So this is more along the lines of what we might expect of the sort of guns that these men most likely had. It might have been older stuff, maybe predating the French and Indian War, and cobbled together stuff with whatever pieces they had to replace parts with. And even the smaller fowling pieces sometimes, like we saw on the previous slide. And then this gun on the left-hand side with the similar trigger guard, has the Queen Anne's hardware that's nice and heavy, and its original mounting, and a lock dating to 1709. So this is a really beautiful piece here. So thank you again, Matt and Margaret at Fort Ty, for all of your last-minute expertise on this. We really appreciate you guys. Now to kind of switch gears into the conservation efforts for this collection, we've got a lot of different materials to work with in this collection. Lead, iron, cupreous pieces, glass, and organics, to name a few. And a lab that is somewhat under renovation at the moment. So I'm just going to give you some quick highlights about some of this, and hopefully in future presentations we can update you all with some more details. So with lead, we're working with a pretty stable material for the most part. And these are coming out of good old Addison County clay, both on land and underwater. And we're talking freshwater. So these are actually in really great shape as they are. And when we start to process these, which would begin with mechanical cleaning, there is the potential for scrubbing off wear marks here because lead is somewhat malleable. And sometimes very slight wear marks can be visible on these surfaces, which can tell us other details about how these ammunitions were used. These could be light striations from being fired. Sometimes you see ramrod marks or worm marks from them being pulled. And you can see an example of that tool on this slide from Fort Ticonderoga's collections. One is a single screw and the other is a double helix. And sometimes you can see indentations of musket balls being packed with buckshot on top, called buck and ball cartridges, where 3 of those smaller bullets would have been pressed down onto a larger musket ball. And you can see an example of a cartridge from Fort Ticonderoga at the very top of this slide. So when we go back through and start to process these, we will make notes on indentations and markings at that time. And also on this slide, you can see some of the types of markings on musket balls and a diagram of a buck and ball. And I grabbed these images from the Civilich book. You can see that resource on the bottom right. It's a really awesome study. In Civilich's studies, they rinsed their collection in cold water and they left the patina intact before taking their weight measurements. And this has to do with retaining the weight of each ball in order to calculate the original spherical diameter for flattened or impacted musket balls. So to further complicate things, the makeup of lead that's used to make these musket balls is also considered in the formula that they developed. And this makeup can be determined by the patina, which is made of lead salts. And the salts have lower density than pure lead. So I'm going to continue to research this before going on to conserve these items so that we are capturing every bit of information from this collection before it's altered by any means of conservation efforts. But generally speaking, again, lead is very stable. And when we do go to conserve these pieces, they won't need much in terms of mechanical cleaning. And then they can be coated in microcrystalline wax after they're cleaned, which will help to dehydrate them and keep the lead from further interacting with moisture in the air. Okay, so if you're sick of musket balls by now, we can move on to some other Rev War projectiles, our iron shot, and also our other iron artifacts, which will get this treatment as well. So our nails, spikes, some buckle fragments. In general, iron artifacts will go through a process called electrolytic reduction or electrolysis. They are placed in a 5% solution of sodium bicarbonate and deionized water, and a positive current is run through sacrificial metal, this green mesh that you can see on the side of our tank. That's our anode or our positive terminal. And then the negative current is run through our negative terminal, which is the iron artifact itself. And this creates a chemical reaction at the surface of the iron where the water molecules break apart on the surface. And you can see the surface of the artifacts actually bubbling. And this movement helps gently remove remaining rust on the surface. So after this process, which for smaller objects can take 4 to 6 weeks, these artifacts are taken out and rinsed in deionized water baths and mechanically cleaned again. Generally for cast iron, you should use softer nylon brushes. For wrought iron, you can use metal brushes. And they go through successive boils and rinses in cold water. After the 3rd boil, the iron objects come out hot, and once the water steams off, you apply tannic acid. This is the second chemical reaction, and this serves as a barrier between the iron and moisture in the air. So there are several coats of tannic acid applied with time to dry in between the applications. And finally, you submerge the iron in 300-degree microcrystalline wax. And sometimes this looks like you are deep frying. And this pushes out any remaining moisture and it seals the iron artifact. While beginning to mechanically clean some of these larger iron projectiles, we have found that several pieces we thought were grape shot or smaller cannonballs actually turned out to be bombs instead. So underneath these rust concretions and caked on clay, you can see in these top photos of these pieces, we discovered wooden fuses. And this has happened a couple times to us now. We just seem to like keep finding these bombs. So for composite objects like this, ideally you could separate the pieces and treat the different materials appropriately. But sometimes you can't do that. So you would do mechanical cleaning first, removing rust and dirt as best you could with picks and brushes for all the exposed iron parts, and then apply isopropyl alcohol to the raw iron for dehydration. And then you would apply a coat of dilute polyurethane to that iron. You could then mechanically clean the wooden components, being as gentle again as you can for these smaller wooden fuses. And you would apply isopropyl alcohol to dehydrate the material again, and then apply a coat of acryloid B72 as the consolidant. There's also a pine rosin treatment that you could use for the wood, where the rosin is actually dissolved in alcohol. So it effectively functions the same way, and the interior cells of the wood are a bit more supported. Here you can see this larger bayonet that was bent and fashioned onto a long wooden pole. This object will get the same treatment that I described for wood and iron, using polyurethane for the iron consolidant and either acryloid B72 or that pine rosin treatment for the wood. And then this smaller object is a two-tine fork with a bone handle, and this will have a very similar treatment as well. For our cupreous objects, these will go through some gentle spot cleaning using a solution of 10% citric acid and deionized water, and the use of a fiberglass bristle brush to remove those darker spots that you can see. They will get several rinses of fresh deionized water to remove the acid, and then you want to dehydrate the cupreous items using 100% isopropyl alcohol in 3 successive baths for at least an hour each. After that third bath, the objects will air dry. And then they'll get a coating of acryloid B72 as well. And you can see a few repeat cupreous objects here that will get this treatment, our hinge and inkwell and our trigger guard fragment. And then we also have a scabbard tip on that bottom left there. To the right, a button example, and above that, an eyepiece for a hook and eye fastener. And I will end things here. I just want to thank all of our partners again for working on this project with us, our friends with AMDA, the Stockbridge-Muncie community, and Abenaki leaders and members, our friends, volunteers, and interns who have all been out in the field with us, and finally to our friends at Fort Ticonderoga, Matt and Margaret, for helping us out with some last-minute details before this presentation. Thanks so much to you guys. And I'll do my best to field some questions now for all of you. I know the presentation was heavier on methodology and interpretation, but please ask conservation questions if you have them. There were many more materials than I was able to cover today. And maybe Chris and Paul can help out with some of those too. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Cher, for sharing your work just now. We do have time for a couple of quick questions before we move on to the next presenter. So starting off, someone is asking, given what you've found, and when you were talking about the casting materials for the musket balls, is it safe to say that sailors were casting musket balls on the vessels, or were they doing that somewhere else?
It's hard to say, but I mean, these guys were living on the boats like close to the island before the Battle of Valcour Island. So, you know, it's potentially they could have been doing that kind of work like well in advance, maybe on land. I'm not sure. You know, it's something to think about in terms of like manufacturing details and so on, but I don't know that you can really prove like whether they were making it on board. Chris, do you have any inkling to that? I'm not sure.
I would guess that they probably had the capability of making some on board, maybe in smaller batches. At other Rev-War related sites, we have found not the gang molds that you showed, but smaller scissor molds that would have been allowed you to make one musket ball at a time. And certainly that's something that you could do around a campfire at night very easily.
I'm not sure what the tools look like for melting the lead either. So, I mean, if you were seeing some of that stuff, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure there were some that were supplied and some that were probably being processed or made during the event.
Yeah, from what I was reading, you know, having the sprues attached and being able to really see those casting marks just indicates that they're not being shipped over. One resource was saying like for musket balls that would have been shipped over, they would have jostled around enough to sort of delete those
Rounded them off.
markings and
Yeah.
like make them all like a little more uniform. So, you know, just being able to see on the majority of those pieces, some of those markings, at least we can say, you know, they're probably being made somewhat locally, if not on the boats.
Super interesting. Thank you. We have a couple of people also asking about explosive materials. Since you're talking about finding bombs, people are wondering, do you have to check to see if they're still live, or how do you handle that kind of material?
Also a great question. I mean, these are wooden fuses, so the assumption is that as soon as these get in the water at this time that this happened, you know, that powder is going to be wet and these are going to be deadened. Because they've been underwater for almost 250 years, you know, they're pretty stuck in and rusted over. So, you know, those concretions really just looked like normal rust, and then you're finding wood underneath them. But, you know, they've spent so much time underwater that, you know, that gunpowder is long gone.
Yeah, certainly a significant concern for explosive shells from later periods in history. You know, if you get closer to the Civil War, the American Civil War, absolutely archaeologically found ordnance can still be quite dangerous and has to be treated with respect, and should involve probably the notification of an ordnance disposal team to come and make sure that things are all safe and sound. But with this 18th or, you know, Revolutionary War era stuff from in water context, in all likelihood, the powder is inert inside from water penetration into the round.
Right, and I think we have time for one more question before we segue into our next presentation. So someone is wondering why polyurethane is used to protect the iron as opposed to other substances like B72 or something like that.
Yeah, so these treatments change in the field every now and then, and so you basically, like, when I'm researching these things, I'm reading what the you know, what the recipes are for now. And so great question. I don't really know all of the ins and outs. It's just the standard practice in the field, honestly.
Great.
Do you have anything to add to that, Paul? Because you're another conservator too. Thanks for helping me field these guys.
Yeah, just to quickly dovetail on that, Cherilyn is right. The recipes for conserving different material types, you know, they do change with time, especially if there are new methods that come out, or if for example, one consultant is able to actually attract more water and it's not as stable. So if we're using that type of consultant on, let's say, Cooper's material, but it's found not to be hydrophobic, meaning it's going to seal out water, but it's actually going to attract moisture in between those layers, then that really leads to that artifact, you know, rusting pretty much, or having more of a patina form underneath of that protective layer. So the recipes and the methodologies do change over time, but a lot of what we do utilize is industry standard.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you all for answering those questions. Let's keep things moving along into our next presentation just to stay on schedule. So welcome back to the screen, Chris. Take it away.
Go here. Okay, so I'm going to specifically be talking about the excavations and the remains of the Royal Galley Congress itself. So let's start with just some kind of generic information about the Congress. The Congress, you know, is classified as a row galley, which I think I could do a whole presentation just on what the hell the definition of a row galley is, because it seems quite flexible, say in the 18th century in particular. A lot of different vessel types are referred to as row galleys that seem to have quite widely variable descriptions and characteristics. But in general, I think they're based off of the design. They're sometimes referred to as Spanish galleys. So they definitely have this kind of Mediterranean connection to them in design. They are often, as is the case with these row galleys, lateen rigged. With the Congress, it's a two-masted vessel, both with large lateen rigged sails on it. The Congress was built at Skenesboro, New York, which is now Whitehall, New York, I mentioned earlier. The keel of the vessel was laid down at the end of July of 1776. And quite remarkably, the boat was launched, by September 1st, which is pretty insane considering the amount of work necessary to complete that haul. At this time, we do know that they were having the boat builders and the sawyers that were collecting the wood for the boats were having to travel quite long distances from Skenesboro to find naturally grown curved oak timbers to make the ribs and principal members of many of these vessels. In some cases, up to 12 miles they'd have to travel just to find an appropriately shaped oak crook for some of these vessels. So imagine the time and effort that was involved in just locating those timbers, let alone cutting them, bringing them back to the shipyard, shaping them, and then working them into a boat. The amount of work here just boggles the mind. And they were able to, basically build that boat in just a little over a month, at least the hull of the vessel. Pretty incredible. The length overall for the boat is about 72 feet. The length of keel 60 and 1/2 feet. Beam of 19 feet, depth of hold 6 feet. You can see there the armament. I don't want to read you this whole slide, but I'm particularly intrigued by the timeline here at the bottom of the slide. Laid down in July, launched in September, arrived at Fort Ticonderoga where it was armed and rigged on the 5th of September and sailed to join the American fleet, which was already stationed at Valcour Island on October 2nd. Right? Joined the fleet on the 5th, fought in the battle on the 11th, and was burned and gone by the 13th. So the boat was still, I'm sure, sparkly and new the time that it was lit on fire and lost. And it was, the ripe old age of 6 weeks old at the time of its burning. Pretty insane. So let's jump into kind of the history of the project here. What we had to work with in 2021 when we went to look for the site, just to relocate it, was the map that was generated from the 1960 survey by Bill Leege and Company, and then also the follow-on survey in the 1980s, which verified that map, and then the follow-on study in 2001 when this site was relocated, and this map that's shown on this slide was drawn. So when we went into the water in 2021 to relocate this site, we were looking for that plank that I showed you sticking out of the water before, and those ballast piles that I described previously as well. The bottom of Arnold's Bay in general is kind of a uniform sandy mud with a significant amount of weed growth during the summer month. So the presence of these odd mounds of, kind of head-sized cobble were pretty clear indicators that we were close to the remains of the Congress itself. And remarkably, we did find that plank still sticking out of the mud. And here is a quick photo I took of it, actually a 3D model I made of it, after a little bit of hand fanning to expose some additional timbers. And here we can see at least 3 hull planks with frame elements above those, and then even the ends of a couple of ceiling planks that were riding over the frame timber. So we were confident we were in the right area. Also, just inshore of this were several little frame tip nubs sticking up out of the mud as well. So we were pretty confident we were back in the area where the Congress remains were located. Fall of 2022, we did this initial excavation at the site. We just had 1 week to do some work in 2022. We employed 2 induction dredges. This is a 2-inch Honda pump based system. We had spoil bags on the end of the dredge system to pick up any small items that we might have accidentally drawn into the dredge. And we went to work. And this is what we expected to find, right? All we had visible at the beginning of the excavation were little frame tips sticking out, and we assumed that the plan was to start at one frame tip, dig down along the length of this frame. We were convinced we were going to come across the center line of the bottom of the vessel, and then we would start up the other side and encounter the other frame tip. Seems reasonable, right? This is what shipwrecks look like. Yeah, well, this is what we found after that excavation in October of 2022. We definitely have these are our exposed frame tips here, but as we followed these frames along, we never encountered those centerline timbers. We never encountered a keelson. We did bump into a couple of well-preserved ceiling planks. We exposed 3 framing elements, 2 floors and 1 futtock inboard here, and then a couple of top timbers and maybe a second futtock out here on the outboard edge. But we were pretty baffled why we weren't finding the centerline timbers that we expected. As we dug down a bit more on what's the left side of this image, we realized that what we actually have is the keel. These 2 floors, which we call floor 6 and floor 7, are attached to the keel. So in fact, what we have is not the bottom of the vessel, but we have this side of the vessel that's broken at the keel and fallen out to starboard. That was a pretty exciting piece of information. That was not something that we expected to find as well, but it very clearly is the keel. It has the rabbet on both sides of the keel. On the what we're now calling the starboard side, the garboard plank is still well seated into the rabbet. On the port side of the keel, it's exposed. That hull plank has pulled away and exposed the rabbet very clearly there. So plus the fact that these 2 main structural floors are bolted down to this timber really suggests this is certainly the keel that we're looking at. Still no evidence of a keelson, which is rather surprising, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So this is where we were at the end of 2022. Now, we were able to make a pretty detailed photogrammetry model of this small section, and it proved to be enormously valuable for a number of reasons. First of all, if the beauty of photogrammetry data is you can manipulate it, look at it from any angle. And if we looked at it from end on, we actually have a really good documentation of the curvature of the frame at this at this section that we've exposed. This kind of kick up here is where those ceiling planks are in the way, but I think we can safely assume that this line continues right here is the outer surface of the framing elements, which is just what you want when you're thinking about a lines drawing. Of course, we have the shape of the keel here on the right end of this drawing, well documented in the photogrammetry model as well. And that allowed us to reorient this drawing to make that keel profile, silhouette, I guess, or oriented vertically as it would have been in the operational life of the vessel. And that shows us that this portion of the vessel is pretty, has a significant dead rise and is a quite narrowly shaped portion of the hull's, the vessel's hull. Certainly very useful information. So we were able to take this curve off of this photogrammetry model as it runs right down to the keel. And then we compared it with the lines drawing of the Roe Galley, Washington. You may remember in my historic context presentation at the beginning, the Roe Galley, Washington was captured by the British on the morning of October 13th. And as the British want to do, they made, with any vessel they capture, they tend to make a nice lines drawing and documentation of that vessel in case it's something they want to replicate in the future. And luckily they did that with the Roe Galley, Washington. The Roe Galley, Washington was a sister ship to the Congress. And while it was built by a different team of shipbuilders, we assume it was built to the same specifications and probably shares many of the same characteristics. So by comparing the curve that we recovered from our photogrammetry model with the body plan of the Roe Galley, Washington, we were able to determine that the section of wreckage that we were looking at came from the very far forward bow of the Roe Galley in between body plan stations 1 and 2. And so this is about 8 feet, 9 feet aft of the forward face of the stem. So that fits pretty well with our understanding of what was left there in Arnold's Bay. Obviously, the stern was pulled out in the 1890s and is no longer with us. This is closer to shore, so we assume this is the bow end of the vessel, and I think this little piece of information alone confirmed that idea to us. And I have to say, this is one of the great powers of photogrammetry. Its ability to document curves very accurately and very quickly is something that shouldn't be disregarded. It's a very powerful tool in that regard. So as we started to think about what we were going to do in 2023, we're working under an archaeological permit from the Navy History and Heritage Command Underwater Archaeology Branch. And you can see here my preliminary planning image where we have, I've laid actually the section that we excavated right in here that's geo-referenced into this map. An estimated extent of the remains. This is the large ballast pile that's just to the north of the existing wreckage. And this is a ballast pile that's found towards the stern. Our theory being that this stern ballast pile was dumped out of that stern section of the Royal Galley Congress when it was yanked off in 1891 and dragged ashore, depositing this relatively small pile of ballast offshore of our main section of Congress remains. Our plan in 2023 was to expand the existing trench and open a new trench along the length of the keel. And when we got to the terminus of the keel inshore, we were going to put another trench there, and we were going to put another trench athwartship at the aft end of the keel fragment that we had. For those of you not from the Champlain Valley, you may not have heard that 2023 was an exceptionally rainy year in the Champlain Valley. We had extensive flooding throughout the area, and that led to really, honestly, pretty terrible visibility in Arnold's Bay for all of 2023. So like any great plan, once it met with reality, we had to make some modifications. So this was a good plan, but we weren't able to achieve all of these goals entirely. But let's talk about what we did do. First of all, we assembled this amazing crew of archaeologists to work with us. I promise this is actually the best picture of us that we got, but it was quite a special crew. And I'll reiterate again that every person in this image, and including one of the people that's not in this image, is an intern or was a former intern of the Maritime Museum, including myself back in, I hate to admit, 1998. But all of these people have acted as interns and have returned to work with us on a full-time basis or returned to volunteer on this project in 2023. Exceptional. Great crew. We again ran our 2-inch pump systems, dredge systems out of a 18-foot inflatable that we kind of use as our dredge barge, and it was sistered up with a pontoon boat that we could stage the divers in and out on, and made for a really nice split platform where we could leave the dredge platform running and run the boat into the shore if we needed to pick up supplies or crew members. Once again, we had the spoil bags on the end of the dredge system, and after each dive, that spoil bag was removed and brought up to the surface to be examined, its contents to be examined. Anything that was found in the spoil bag, we knew would be, was from the work that diver did at that time, and we could therefore give it some context, at least generally, as to where that diver was working. You can see Cher here really enjoying herself, pawing through the millions of zebra mussel shells, wood fragments, and the occasional artifact that was found in the spoil bags. We did find a couple of really exciting artifacts, not many. Obviously, most of the artifacts had been removed in the 1960s by Bill Leege's group. Thankfully, they have come back to the museum and are available to study, as Patricia documented well in her presentation. But we did find a few mostly smaller objects, quite a few more lead shot, as Cherilyn pointed out. A couple of buttons. We have a mysterious brass fragment. We're not sure what this is. It's a corner of something. way up into where we believe the bow of the boat was previously. We did find this, quite well-preserved leather shoe. And the artifact that I was most excited about was this tiny little piece of glass that we found. And it is most likely a button insert, maybe a cuff button. And it's clear glass, as you can see, but it actually has an embossed motif of a ship on that little glass bead. And it's tiny, it's smaller than a dime. It's very small, and but it was very exciting to find an artifact on a shipwreck that actually had a ship represented on it. Very cool artifact. But the main artifact that we were examining, of course, was the remains of the vessel itself. As I mentioned previously, the visibility in 2023 in the bay was quite atrocious. So once again, we relied on the power of photogrammetry to really document the process of the excavation. So this is the first photogrammetry model we made as we started to work. We certainly never saw it like this underwater. What you saw underwater was just what was in about 18 inches in front of you, and that was about it. So the ability to assemble hundreds of images into a three-dimensional model that showed you the entire site in one time was really a spectacular tool in this application. Of course, with low visibility, that means you have to get really close to your subject when you're taking pictures for photogrammetry. So to make these models, we were often collecting more than 1,000 images because we just had to be right up close to it. But you can see we've expanded our initial trench here in the middle. These are our two frames that we had excavated previously in 2022. We were hoping to expand that trench quite far. We uncovered some more of the keel, and we started working on the outboard end of the frames as well, just to see how far the structure extended in both directions on the outboard edge. Here is the following one. This is probably a week later. We've exposed quite a bit more of the keel. We've worked towards the stern and exposed the ends of the planking on the outboard edge. This over here is actually that plank that I showed you from 2001 that was just barely sticking out of the mud. So this is the timber that led us to the wreck, and now we've exposed its friends and family here as we work in this area of the hull remains. And this is our final photogrammetry model that we made after 3 weeks of excavation at the site. We were able to expose quite a few more frames. We have, let me get my stats here. In total, the section of wreckage that we have is 28 feet long and 13 feet wide, which if you add that 28 feet to the approximately 28 or 29 feet of stern wreckage that was removed in 1890, we have representation, at least with photographs for the stern and with this excavation for the bow, of the majority of the hull, at least the lower part of the hull. And in our case, just the starboard side. We exposed lots more of the keel. There is about 14.5 feet of keel exposed here. Sadly, aft of frame 5, the keel is broken off. Pretty jagged. It's a pretty jagged break too. So I'm really curious how that actually occurred. On the forward end, the keel is actually cut down quite a bit to below the rabbit, and presumably, but then it continues for another 4 feet in this cut down manner, and presumably this is where the stem of the vessel would have been scarfed into the keel. Sadly, no evidence of the stem itself present, but in the base of the trench here, a couple of in what's left of the keel, a couple of bolt fragments that are torqued over to the side and broken off. So perhaps evidence of that stem being yanked off or impacted by ice or other natural activity, but probably man-made. We see pretty quickly some really interesting features about the boat in general. Its framing pattern is particularly interesting to me, and actually we'll talk about that in a second. Let's carry on. It's pretty remarkable to see all of this in one photogrammetry model, and I'm really happy with the way this turned out, despite the fact that we weren't able to excavate quite as much as we had wanted. We had hoped to continue this keel trench, all the way aft, but since it terminated prematurely, we stopped there. As we continued forward, the keel in that cut down state does continue into this wall of our excavation trench. But at this point, we were down probably close to 4 feet below the sediment level, and it was getting a little dicey to work in the bottom of that trench. And to even move forward another foot, we would have had to remove just a tremendous amount of overburden. And the visibility conditions and our time constraints meant that we had to stop our excavations at this point for 2023. So this is the portion of the hall that I'm convinced that we're looking at this point. It's a pretty goodly sized portion of the starboard side of this row galley. Again, this drawing is actually made from the lines drawing of the row galley Washington. So we are making some assumptions here that they are very similar vessels, but I think this gives you a good representation of what we have exposed in Arnold's Bay during these excavations. Now, some of the more interesting construction features that we notice include the presence of both wood and iron fasteners, as you can see in this disarticulated futtock that we found out in that stern ballast pile during 2021, I think. And it very clearly has fastener holes both for trunnels and for iron nails. We also found lots of iron nails in our excavations and in the metal detecting survey around the site. This is a particularly standard issue thing that you see in late 18th century English shipbuilding in particular, is the use of both wooden fasteners as well as iron fasteners. As I mentioned just briefly before, the framing pattern is quite interesting, and it is mostly composed of disarticulated frame components. Not all of the futtocks are fastened to the floors of the vessel. Even in that trench that we opened in 2022, this was obvious. As we have these the two floors, this is floor 7 and floor 6, and we have this first futtock in between those and attached to neither of them. In fact, separated by 4 or 5 inches on one side and 3 or 4 inches on the other side. So definitely a floating futtock in between these two floors. And this type of framing pattern is something that the more you look into 18th century English-based shipbuilding, or the English tradition shipbuilding, you see this open framing pattern quite a bit. This drawing is actually from my thesis work on the fur trading sloop, the Nancy, that operated on the Great Lakes, was built in Detroit in 1789, and then participated in the War of 1812. But and I documented this in 1997, I think. It also displays this open framing pattern, where in the case of the Nancy, every third frame was a made frame, where the futtocks were actually fastened to the floor with iron, laterally fastened to them with iron bolts. But in between, there were a couple of frames with these floating futtocks where they weren't attached to each other. And here you can see in the top one, the made frames are displayed in color, and on this bottom one, you can see the disarticulated or floating frames, open frames, with the floors and their associated futtocks in the same color. This type of framing pattern, the more, like I said, the more we look for it, the more we see it, and particularly here in the Champlain Valley, it's very well represented. The French and Indian War sloop Boscawen certainly displays this kind of framing pattern. Though opposed to the Nancy, it's every 4th floor in the Boscawen that is a made frame, as opposed to every 3rd floor in the Nancy. We also see suggestions of this framing pattern in the Duke of Cumberland. This is a vessel that was recovered It's another French and Indian War era vessel that was recovered on the banks of Lake Champlain at Fort Ticonderoga in 1909, I believe. But by just looking at the spacing of the frames in this rather high quality photograph for the time, I must say, it's pretty evident that open framing is also present in this vessel. We see it in this vessel from Lake George, which is just south of Lake Champlain, and that is also a French and Indian War era vessel that's commonly referred to as the Tuttle sloop, was recovered by a gentleman named Tuttle. Certainly has this framing pattern as well. And even this top image is of what would become the War of 1812 vessel, the Ticonderoga, which was actually laid down as a steamboat hull originally. And then in 1812, it was taken over by the Navy, who converted it into a war vessel. But it has this same kind of open framing pattern. From my studies around the Nancy, it really appears that this open framing pattern kind of peters out pretty quickly after the War of 1812. So it's something I'm certainly interested in spending some more time digging into and finding other examples of throughout North America and elsewhere. But it really seems to fade away pretty quickly after the War of 1812. And I certainly can't explain why that is, but seems to be the case. The other particularly interesting feature I find on this boat, and perhaps it's representative of the speed at which it was built, is the variability in the timber dimensions. They're kind of all over the place, to be honest with you. While all of these framing components are roughly the same molded dimension, they're all about 8 inches, give or take, in their molded dimension. In their sided dimensions, they're all over the place. The floors tend to be a little more consistent. They range between 6 inches sided and 7.5 inches sided, with most of them clustering around the 6-inch mark. It's in the futtocks that we really see a very dramatic variation in size. Futtock 7, which is this one here, is only 6.2 inches in its sided dimension, so that's across this way. But then you can look at other examples like Futtock 6, which is this one, which is obviously even visually quite a bit larger. It's 8.5 inches wide. Then we have this oddball way out here, which is absolutely enormous. This is Futtock 3, which is 10.5 inches sided. So, you know, a solid 4.5 inches larger than these other futtocks. So they definitely have a wide variability in size for many of these timbers. The spacing on the floors is just shy of 2 feet. On center, these are separated 23.5 inches. The keel is 9 inches in its sided dimension across the top, and about 13 inches in its molded dimension. Pretty good sized hunk of wood that was used to make the keel. We have 4 ceiling planks represented, and they range in size from 10 inches to 15 inches in width, and they're all 2 inches thick, which is the same thickness dimension of the hull planking that we can access. And that they tend to vary between 8.5 inches and 12 inches in width. So kind of all over the place, certainly with the framing dimensions. And I would suggest that that's a representative of the fact that they were just making these boats with whatever timber they could get their hands on. We have not collected wood samples from these elements of the ship's construction yet. That's something we hope to accomplish this year, so that we can do wood type analysis on the various components of the structure and get a better idea of what they were making these boats out of. So, and the other, probably the most exciting possibility here is that there's still a port side. If we're looking at the starboard side, I think it's quite likely that there is at least some remnants of the port side that are still present underneath this giant pile of rocks. Right? When Bill Leege and company were working here in the 1960s, they mentioned that they removed all the ballast stones from this section that they excavated, and they took them just outside of the frame tips and they deposited them to the north of the wreckage. it's quite possible that they were depositing them onto the untouched port side of this vessel, which means it's not only under its own ballast or pile of ballast, but now it has additional ballast from the starboard side that's been deposited onto it in the 1960s. So that's both concerning because it'll be a substantial amount of work to access that portion of the wreck, but also quite exciting because it would be a portion of the wreck that hadn't been exposed before and theoretically would have its artifact collection intact. So that's work for the future. This year, we hope to uncover this one more time so that we can get a more detailed photogrammetry model and documentation of it with hopefully better visibility this year. We hope to collect those wood samples, and we might do a little bit of probing at some other areas to see if there's other remains extant. I don't know that we're going to have time to really literally dig into the port side to see what's there. We might save that for a future operation entirely. But for a vessel type that we know very little about, I think even just exposing this 28-foot long section of one side of the vessel has proved to be extremely informative and valuable moving forward with our gaining a better understanding of the construction of the row galleys. So with that, I'll wrap things up and answer any questions you might have quickly, and then we can move on to Paul's presentation about site formation processes.
Thank you so much, Chris. We do have a lot of questions coming in that people are having about the boats and the site.
Great.
So really quickly, when you were speaking about dimensions of various things at the site, someone is wondering, what do you mean between sited dimensions or other dimensions of things?
Sure. When you're talking about ship timbers, there are two principal measurements that you talk about. That's the sited dimension and the molded dimension. And you might say, well, why don't you just talk about the width and length of that or the height of it? And the reason is because ships' timbers are all curved. So what might be the width of it here, if you follow that timber up around a curve, it's now not really the depth, it's more the width. So there's some confusion there about what the proper terminology would be there. So there's this whole nautical stuff is the jargon is dense, and even when it comes to describing hull timbers, there's a specific set of measurements that you talk about, and that's the sided and molded dimensions. So one way to think about it is the sided, if we're looking at the keel, the sided dimension is really what we might commonly refer to as the width. It's the part that runs across the ship. Whereas the molded dimension, or what we might commonly refer to as the depth, is the part that runs out of the hull, through the hull. So that's just the way the terminology is used. So really we're talking about width and height, I guess, but it's complicated, as you can see.
Great, thanks, Chris. We also have several people who are curious about the preservation of the wood. Some people are asking if there is any difference in the rate of deterioration of the wood when it's buried under mud versus when it is directly exposed to the lake water, or if it's under the ground on dry land.
Yeah, what a great question. Absolutely something that's buried in the dense calcium-based clay mud that we have at the bottom of Lake Champlain. Exceptional organic preservation. The wood is still rock hard. Excuse me, as Patricia mentioned, there are tool markings visible on some of the surfaces of these timbers. Sometimes the corners of the timbers themselves are still relatively sharp and crisp. It's quite exceptional. Since the only portions that were really exposed above the mud line were just the tips of the frames, those are certainly deteriorated. In some cases, they had been covered with zebra mussels, which are the invasive mollusk species that we have in Lake Champlain that fastens to everything solid. To some extent, they may be obvious that they were burned. It's hard to tell exactly how much of the damage to those frame tips is from the burning or from ice damage, from other impacts. It's difficult to tell, but generally speaking, wood that's buried in the mud at the bottom of Lake Champlain is extremely well preserved, and that's certainly the case with these hull remains.
Great. And see, people have a couple of related questions, which are, after you've done the excavation, do you cover them up again to protect them? Do you leave them as they are? How do you treat that?
Absolutely. We backfilled the site with mud that we dredged from it the first time so that it is protected from the environment. Now, we didn't put as much mud back into it as we removed from it. And thankfully, so when we go back in 2024, that mud that we pumped back into it will not be as consolidated as it was when we removed it in 2023, and it should come out pretty quickly so that we can clean it up again and get another photogrammetry model. When the project is done, we will certainly backfill it, probably with more mud than we removed from it, so that it's protected by maybe a shallow mound of mud that will then compact down over the coming years and recreate that preservative environment of the mud at the bottom of the lake.
Right, kind of on that preservation protection track, several people are wondering whether there are restrictions on anchoring in Arnold's Bay, or how do you protect that site from damage to anchors? Or from anchors?
Well, luckily it's just buried most of the time. So, and it's in really shallow water. This is not something that I mentioned, but we're working in 6 feet of water, maybe 8 feet of water once you've dug the hole. It's not a deep part of Arnold's Bay. The whole bay is not particularly deep. It's not even at the mouth of the bay. It's only 15 feet deep, but this is close enough to shore that it's an area where boats aren't typically anchoring. And even if they do, the 99.9% of the boat is covered by at least 18 inches of mud, and is protected from any damage in that regard.
Great, thank you, Chris. I think for time's sake, we're going to segue on into Paul's presentation now, but for anyone who has been asking questions, please keep them coming, and we'll try our best to circle back to everything that we can at the very end. So thank you very much, Chris.
Thank
and
you.
Paul, take it away. Tell us a bit about site formation processes.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Cher. Thank you, Patricia. And thank you, Jack. And most importantly, thank you, the public, everyone who is here for this presentation. We really appreciate you making the time to come and see our virtual archaeology conference. Now, without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. And we today are talking about site formation processes. And basically, we're going to be defining the theoretical process of archaeology for the Revolutionary Warship Congress. Here we go. The goal of this presentation is to inform our audience of the history and use life of Congress and how it fits into the overall theoretical framework of site formation processes by exploring the warship in its systemic context as a primary support vessel in its pre-depositional setting. The presentation will continue to investigate vessel once it fell into disuse through scuttling, abandonment, and primary salvage. Finally, the archaeological context of Congress will be explained in its post-depositional setting through salvage processes and how human behaviors and non-cultural transformation processes have affected the integrity of the site. As cultural resource managers, we are obligated to share why the preservation and management of Congress is important in stewardship of this irreplaceable archaeological site for the public and stakeholders. The theoretical concept of site formation processes aids in this mission by viewing the vessel through the lens of behavioral archaeology to observe how Congress is impacted by human actions. And I'm just going to say that be prepared, everyone, because we're going to be going through a lot of very dense theory, but this is important. This really is the basis of theoretical foundations as to why we need to understand archaeological sites, and more importantly, maritime archaeological sites. To fully understand the theoretical concept of site formation processes, we must first look to the development of the concept from the discipline of behavioral archaeology. In 1975, Michael B. Schiffer, J. Jefferson Reid, and William J. Rathje published, quote, Behavioral Archaeology, 4 Stages, unquote. At its core, behavioral archaeology is defined as, quote, the study of material objects, regardless of time and space, in order to describe and explain human behavior, unquote. Schiffer, Reid, and Rathje state that the relationship between human behavior and material objects can be approached from several directions, depending on the nature of the question asked. They developed 4 strategies in behavior archaeology defined on the basis of question type. The 4 strategies, as outlined above, reviews how material culture from a past society or cultural group can be used to answer questions about past behavior. The second strategy is concerned with how present material culture can provide archaeologists with information regarding past human behavior. The third strategy focuses on studying past material culture in order to answer questions about present human behavior. Finally, the fourth strategy examines present-day material culture to examine contemporary human behavior. And I just want to mention that furthermore, in Schiffer's work in his book, Behavior Archaeology, he states that the archaeological record is, quote, a distorted reflection of past behavioral system, unquote. To have a better understanding of past human behaviors, this distortion can be eliminated by the use of 3 sets of data of controlled factors. The first being correlates, which related material objects or spatial relations in archaeological contexts to specific types of human behavior. Correlates are reliable indicators that allow archaeologists to deduce how artifacts were made, distributed, used, and recycled in living societies. However, the interpretation of archaeological sites and associated correlates require the consideration of site formation processes, notably those that determine how material is transferred from a systemic to an archaeological context, and the fate of what happened to the material after it was deposited into the archaeological record. Systemic context reflects artifacts when they're actively engaged in a behavioral system. On the other hand, artifacts that interface with the natural environment in a depositional setting are regarded as existing in an archaeological context. Objects move from the systemic to the archaeological context, but there are also instances when objects move back and forth between both contexts. To illuminate the theoretical aspect of site formation processes in behavioral archaeology, they are broken down into cultural formation processes and non-cultural formation processes. And as the slide here describes, cultural formation processes are defined as the processes of human behavior that affect or transform artifacts after their initial use in a given activity. This process preserves artifacts in the systemic context to create the historic record through reuse, the archaeological record through the deposition of artifacts, and any consequent cultural alterations of material in both records. Non-cultural formation processes are influenced by all occurrences in the natural environment that affect the archaeological record. They affect artifacts in systemic and archaeological contexts by influencing decay patterns, changes in sedimentation, natural disturbances, and the accumulation of ecological evidence that can be used to ascertain ancient environmental conditions. Elaborating on cultural formation processes, several different processes are attributed to cultural formations. They include reuse processes, which are defined as a change in the user or use or form of an artifact following its initial use. Reclamation processes, discard processes, which occur when the artifact is no longer able to fulfill a symbolic or functional role, leading to the artifact to become outdated as it is no longer conform a use. Third is reclamation processes, which is where artifacts and material are changed from the archaeological context back to the systemic context. And then finally, disturbance, which is the final transformation process that results in an artifact or an entire site being altered by both cultural behaviors as well as environmental processes. And as you can see, within each of these processes, there are variations. However, for the sake of timing in this presentation, we won't really be able to fully explore them on this side, but we will be able to talk about them a little bit later on as we continue with this presentation. Since the development of cultural and site formation processes, maritime archaeologists have adopted these theoretical principles and adapted them to the context of shipwreck events and underwater archaeological sites. While the number of papers and archaeologists who have worked on the adaptation of these concepts are numerous, there are some examples that are relevant to our discussion today. First and foremost, Keith McElroy helped to establish site formation processes for use in the interpretation of maritime archaeological sites in his article on the archaeology of shipwrecks in Maritime Archaeology, a reader of substantive and theoretical contributions. He states that, quote, "A shipwreck is an event by which a highly organized and dynamic assemblage of artifacts is transformed into a static and disorganized state for long-term stability," unquote. Influenced by a variety of processes affecting the shipwreck event before, during, and after, researchers need to understand them to make sense of the site. Only then can the data be properly interpreted. An understanding of other factors, such as marine environmental processes, human interference, extracting filters, and scrambling devices are also needed. McElroy outlines these processes in the flow diagram, as seen in the slide, that represents the evolution of a shipwreck. Stewart provides an outline of the depositional processes in maritime archaeological sites, along with an example of formation processes, the nature of the submerged deposit, and examples with references as seen in Table 1 of this slide. The actual wrecking event can be catastrophic and is varied in the process with effects on the ship itself and associated contents. For example, a ship may sink relatively intact with lighter buoyant material floating away, while a disintegration or capsizing event can scatter most material over a large area. Scuttling or abandonment are examples of intentional deposition, which can yield much of the original ship material if it could not be removed at the time when the vessel sank, or the vessel may be devoid of the material as a hulk. The vessel may also fall victim to sinking from water inundation, where a slow gradual flood will displace most artifacts from their original context versus a rapid inundation, which, surprisingly, will preserve most materials in place. Even with the deposition of artifacts at an archaeological site, deposited material can move back and forth through the archaeological and systemic contexts. Elaborating on the post-depositional formation processes that Stewart outlines in Table 2, we start with cultural formation processes of reclamation, construction, fishing, dredging, refuse, and loss. Environmental and non-cultural transformation processes, such as marine borers, or in our case for Lake Champlain, the zebra mussels, can destroy wooden structures. Other environmental processes, such as bioturbation, waves, tides, currents, and colluvial actions can further affect underwater archaeological sites. Furthermore, several other archaeologists over the past 40 years have continued to work on and expand the understanding of site formation processes, developed by McElroy's flow diagram in 1978. Ward, Lacombe, and Veth outline a methodological approach using McElroy's shipwreck evolution flowchart, modified to consider other variables that describe the process rather than the outcome of site formation. While predictive modeling for wreck disintegration is useful as a process-oriented, temporally and spatially independent paradigm, they argue that it does not fully account for the processes of wreck disintegration. In Martin Gibbs' article from 2006, Cultural Site Formation Processes in Maritime Archaeology, Disaster Response, Salvage, and McElroy 30 Years On, The cultural formation processes that influence the shipwreck event are investigated and outlined in conjunction with McElroy's evolutional model. Like Ward, Lacombe, and Veth, Gibbs adopts this theoretical approach, but argues that human behaviors have not really been fully investigated in their applicability to wreck processes. Disaster studies models in pre-impact and post-impact stages and human responses are utilized to interpret the archaeological formation of a wreck site. Finally, the use of site formation processes on underwater archaeological sites was further developed in the context of abandonment and ship graveyards. While the work in the development of the theoretical approaches will not be fully explained in this presentation, I want to briefly review Nathan Richards' work on ship graveyards, abandoned watercraft, and the archaeological site formation process. In his book, Richard elaborates upon ideas from shipwrights' cultural and natural transformation processes used as fundamental ideologies for site formations. These processes encompass reuse, discard, loss, abandonment, reclamation, and disturbance processes. While he recognizes that these processes are equally important to the study of site formations, only 3 of them are essential to watercraft abandonment. They are, quote, evidence of activities during use, those that are evident of the processes of abandonment, and those that are evident of activities after abandonment, unquote. In the diagrams, Richard provides examples of site formation processes acting on watercraft in their systemic context based on the use life of a vessel and post-abandonment processes. For example, as a vessel is constructed, like Congress, its uses are based on the initial intended function of the vessel in one of 2 phases. Primary mercantile, as the vessel is made for commercial or mercantile function, like a cargo schooner, and primary support, where the vessel is made for non-commercial reasons and only used for support, like a work barge, or in this case, a warship. As the vessel deteriorates over time, it will fall into disuse due to changes in the technological and economic climate, and will enter pre-depositional salvage and abandonment processes. And after all of that, we are finally going to get into the depth of how these theoretical paradigms and principles apply to site formation processes in Congress. As we explore the density of these frameworks and how they apply to the vessel for its history and use life, I will outline the cultural formation processes in its pre-depositional and post-depositional contexts, with examples of concepts that we just reviewed. The start of the use life of Congress occurred when it was built in Skenesboro, New York in 1776. The vessel was made along with other warships used in the defense of Lake Champlain and in the Battle of Valcour Island in October 1776. In review, the construction of Congress and the other vessels occurred in pre-depositional context, where the vessel's intended primary support function was for patrol, defense, and naval warfare on the waters of Lake Champlain. I want to note that this arms race occurred during a technological and economic climate in the Champlain Valley, where continental forces were hard-pressed to provide naval vessels, supplies, and weapons against the British Navy, a force vastly superior at the time and much larger, effective, and well-supplied. Congress and the other vessels under the command of Benedict Arnold engaged the British Navy during the Battle of Valcour Island in 1776. As a warship, the use life of Congress continued as a primary support vessel throughout the engagement. As the Continental Fleet was stationed within the interior of Valcour Bay during the engagement with the British fleet, they were significantly outmatched and suffered losses. During the engagement, Congress suffered damage from incoming British cannon fire. However, it did not sink. Over the next 2 days, as the remaining vessels in Arnold's fleet escaped from Valcour Island, Congress continued to be attacked as the fleet gradually made their way towards Ferris Bay, which, as we all know, is commonly known as Arnold's Bay today. Following the aftermath of the battle and escape from Valcour Bay, Arnold made the decision to scuttle the remaining fleet of Congress and the 4 gondolas, in Ferris Bay, Vermont. Collectively, the vessels were still in a pre-depositional context of systemic use before they entered the archaeological context. The use of fire to scuttle the vessels is part of the abandonment process, where the vessels were denied as prizes to the British Navy. The vessels also experienced disuse, given their condition and decision made by Arnold to abandon them. Within this context, it is important to note that the vessels were still in their pre-depositional context. As historic accounts mention, the vessels also underwent pre-depositional primary salvage between the years of 1776 and 1777. Materials that likely would have been salvaged included cannons, munitions such as shot, and other potentially usable items like iron fasteners and tools. Historic accounts denote that the cannons were raised from the wreckage of the fleet to be used for ballast on British vessels. Since the salvage efforts of 1776 and 1777 conducted by the British, there are no clear historic accounts of further pre-depositional salvage efforts undertaken on Congress in Arnold's Bay. That is until researchers at the museum found newspaper articles as part of the Arnold's Bay Research Project, starting in 2020 and continuing to this day. One of the first newspapers found is an article titled Miscellany, General Arnold and the Congress Galley, from the Vergennes Vermonter in 1866. This article describes how citizens of Vergennes took wooden planks off Congress and fashioned them into canes. This was in vogue for, quote, gentlemen to furnish themselves with walking canes made from the oak timber of this old relic of bygone days, unquote. The article further mentions an iron 18-pound cannon removed many years ago from the wreck of Congress, which eventually made its way to Burlington and was nicknamed Long John. Other munitions like grape shot and musket balls were also mentioned as being obtained. I feel it's important to note that the remains of Congress are no longer within the systemic context in its pre-depositional setting at the time they entered into the archaeological context in a post-depositional setting. Utilizing both Schiffer's and Richard's theoretical concepts of cultural formation processes, the type of salvage that occurred is termed secondary salvage. However, we will really never know if this indeed was secondary salvage, tertiary, quaternary, quinary, so on and so forth, as there are no clearly documented historic records of reclamation and salvage processes. Newspaper accounts in the 19th century continue to mention historic reclamation and salvage processes on the remains of Congress. What is more curious is the mention of the remains of grape shot and an English case knife that had washed up ashore near the remains of the wreck. The discovery of these artifacts in 1870 are clear examples of non-cultural transformation processes, where the initial burial of artifacts in sediment is termed as perturbation, and the process of exposure of artifacts through processes that led to an unburial are known as weathering. It's important to note that the remains of the vessel, the other gunboats, and the archaeological remains of the entire battlefield of Arnold's Bay experienced these non-cultural transformation processes. And these processes also continue to influence and affect all occurrences in the natural environment that affect the archaeological record. Reclamation and salvage processes continue throughout the rest of the 19th century. And as I mentioned before, it's really not clear what type of salvage, whether it's secondary, tertiary, so on and so forth, occurred. But we do know that this cultural transformation process of post-depositional salvage continued well into the latter half of the 19th century. Various newspapers mentioned the removal of artifacts from the wreck by relic hunters or as material being made into presentation gavels. These post-depositional behaviors are interesting because the artifacts and materials constantly being removed from the archaeological context are actually being reincorporated back into the systemic context through reclamation, salvage and collection, and the reuse process of recycling. Recycling is the return of an artifact after some period of use to a manufacturing process, such as the working of an oak timber from Congress into a gavel or a cane. Lateral cycling may have also occurred and is defined as a change in an artifact's user, where the transfer of artifacts occur from individual to individual or social unit to social unit. This is only valid if the artifact's form and use are not altered. For example, the 18-pound cannon mentioned earlier in the 1866 newspaper article was removed from a wreck by local salvagers in Virgins, and then ended up transitioning to someone else or another social unit later on in Burlington. One of the most substantial reclamation and salvage processes to occur on the remains of Congress is noted from the Burlington Clipper on November 24th, 1892, when Captain C.W. Adams of West Addison raised a large section of Congress. The amount of the archaeological remains hauled out consisted of approximately 30 feet of the after part of the keel and keelson with a number of ribs. This post-depositional cultural formation process substantially altered the remains of the vessel, where a considerable portion of the wreck was removed from its archaeological context. Subsequent newspaper articles mention the working of the remaining timbers into canes, gavels, and other furnishment of relics. Recycling and lateral cycling processes continued to occur as the remains of Congress were removed from its archaeological post-depositional context and entered back into the systemic context of use. This slide is more or less a continuation of the news story from 1892, showing the removal of the aft section Congress by Captain Adams. The image to the left is from the Yonkers Herald, in an article from November 24th, 1900, titled Arnold's Flagship, Relics of the Historic Ship Congress to be Preserved. This article states that after the section of the vessel was raised and deposited on Captain Adams' property, crowds of visitors and relic hunters thronged to the spot, and the latter were so persistent that large pieces of the oak ship were stolen, and it was in a fair way of being carried off altogether. When this came to the ears of the members of the New York Historical Society, they decided to build a museum at Caldwell on Lake George. The remains of the gallant ship may rest in peace, free from the knives and axes of vandals. While plans to remove the remains of the stern section of Congress to the New York Historical Society did not transpire, sometime after 1892, the remains were removed to Chimney Point, Vermont, where they left to sit outside exposed to the elements. As the remains were never protected and science of archaeological conservation was not in existence at the time, the stern section slowly deteriorated until there was nothing left. Ultimately, this section of the Congress fell out of the systemic record. Despite the loss of the archaeological remains of the Congress after it was removed from the archaeological context and brought back into the systemic context, public curiosity on the archaeological site continued to endure in the early 20th century. The last known public reclamation and salvage activities occurred in 1934, when Paul Billhuber of Douglaston, Long Island, New York, used a diving helmet while on vacation at Basin Harbor to search for the remains of the wreck of Congress. As Mr. Billhuber searched the bottom of Arnold's Bay, he came across a cannon found sticking out of the mud. Along the cannon, he raised and displayed in his front yard on top of a millstone. Mr. Billhuber also found other artifacts such as cannonballs, grape shot and bar shot, pewter spoons, belt buckles, and apparently a sword belt from the wreck of the Royal Savage. While the salvage processes are mentioned in Arnold's Bay, there is no mention as to which of the vessels the cannon and artifacts came from. These continued post-depositional activities kept the cultural formation processes of reclamation and lateral cycling occurring as the remains were removed from the post-depositional context and entered back into the systemic context of use. By the middle of the 20th century, we still continue to see efforts to locate archaeological remains and material in Arnold's Bay. In 1952, marine salvager engineer Lorenzo Haglund, who is credited for raising the gunboat Philadelphia and Royal Savage, along with other vessels, conducted work in Arnold's Bay to raise the remains of the last unknown gondola. His work from the beginning basically started an era of avocational maritime archaeology, where his efforts to raise the unknown gunboat led to an attempt to preserve the vessel in a proposed museum in Essex, New York. Unfortunately, the venture did not succeed, and the remains of the gondola were left outside and exposed to the elements and to the misfortune of relic hunters. The remains of the vessel were moved to a barn somewhere in Willsboro, New York, for storage, and then at some point in time, they ended up near Unstable Chasm, New York. And the exact details of the fate of the unknown gunboat are not entirely clear, though research suggests that it was destroyed during the construction of a campground near Unstable Chasm. William Leege is another pioneer in conducting avocational archaeology and investigations in Congress in the 1960s. Mr. Leege and his team excavated the starboard side of the vessel by employing metal detectors, historic research, visual surveys, dredging, and the systematic recovery of artifacts still extant on the site. In terms of post-depositional site formation processes, the cultural formations and transformation processes that occurred basically altered the deposition of artifacts as they were removed from the site and thus brought them back into the systemic context through reclamation and reuse. Consequently, these artifacts are still within the systemic context of collection and lateral cycling, where they're kept for a while in private collection and then ultimately donated to the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum in 1997, where they are now curated and managed by the museum under its repository collections agreement with the United States Navy. Following the work of avocational archaeologists, professional archaeological documentation and recovery was conducted on the remains of Congress by Dr. Kevin Chrisman from the Nautical Archaeology program at Texas A&M. Between two archaeological field investigations done in 1984 and 1985, Dr. Chrisman and the Champlain Maritime Society surveyed, documented, excavated parts of Congress. They also conducted recovery work by removing artifacts such as a sheave wheel, a gun flint, fauna remains such as bone, and brick fragments. The work done by Dr. Chrisman and the Champlain Maritime Society is a continuation of reclamation and reuse processes in a post-depositional setting, where artifacts were recovered from their archaeological context and brought back into the systemic context. Consequently, these processes also primarily create the historic record. Presently, the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum has conducted multiple surveys of Congress and the surrounding area of Arnold's Bay, both on land and in water. A survey done in 2001 documented the Galley Congress in an inspection report conducted for the Naval Historical Center and the Department of Defense. While no post-depositional cultural formation processes, such as reclamation and reuse, occurred at the site, non-cultural transformation processes, such as exposure of the hull and the increased colonization from biological agents like zebra mussels, were observed, factors that can have a significant impact on the preservation of the archaeological remains of this vessel. Renewed interest in Arnold's Bay began again in 2020 and continued today. Work officially started after the museum was awarded the American Battlefield Protection Program Battlefield Preservation and Planning Grant through the National Park Service to conduct archaeological resource at Arnold's Bay, under permit from the Naval Heritage and History Command and the Vermont Division of Historic Preservation. Archaeological work and cultural formation processes of reclamation and reuse are the primary post-depositional processes to occur at the site. Both past and current recovered archaeological material further informs the historic record as they're used in the museum's collection for research, interpretation, and analysis. So, why is all this important? This is important because we here at the museum, as maritime archaeologists, we rely on theoretical principles and explanations to gain a better understanding of why an archaeological site is an archaeological site today. The previous disturbances and cultural formation processes, along with non-cultural formation processes, highly affect the integrity of any archaeological site. Sometimes these effects are positive, such as the application of archaeological work done by Leege to survey the remains of Congress, which allowed us to study the material culture related to the vessel. This also allows future generations to study these remains and hopefully instill a sense of stewardship and respect for maritime archaeological sites. Sometimes the effects are negative, such as the removal of whole sections of the vessel, which removes context. If those remains are left exposed to the elements without proper documentation and conservation, then that part of history is lost forever. As cultural resource managers, we're obligated to share why the preservation and management of Congress is important in stewardship of this irreplaceable archaeological site for the public and stakeholders. The theoretical concept of site formation processes aids in this mission by viewing the vessel through the lens of behavioral archaeology to observe how Congress is impacted by both human behaviors and natural processes. And with that, I am ending my presentation. And again, I want to give my thanks to everyone who made time to attend our virtual archaeology conference. Are there any questions?
Thank you for that, Paul. And I'd like to just take this moment to also welcome back any of our past presenters so that we can all kind of gather together and take a look at our final Q&A. Thanks, everyone. So we do have some questions that are still left over from previous presentations. And to anyone in the audience who has something on their mind that they want to ask, if you think of it in the moment, feel free to keep sending them in, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So kind of related to Paul, how you were talking about the stewardship of the Congress, people are wondering about how you manage a wreck in the lake, and someone has asked if there are plans to raise the Congress or if it is going to have another management practice.
Chris, I don't know if you wanted to help me out with this question. We do not currently have plans to raise it. It's important to leave wrecks like this in situ or in place because one of the wonders of Lake Champlain is it's a freshwater environment. The mud does a wonderful job at protecting archaeological sites from deterioration. So it essentially does the conservation work for us. And also in terms of management, Congress is a warship. It is owned by the United States Navy. So the process of going through and managing it really has to include them. Not only does it include them, it includes other stakeholders, the public, and really coming together for having a collective vision of what that management and the future of the vessel is going to look like.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary, Paul. And certainly the Navy are the management authorities here, so we follow their lead whenever possible. And we're really working with them on these projects to manage these sites. So that's the ultimate authority here. Um, Recovery, certainly not in this case. As Paul mentioned, the preservation in the lake is exceptional the way it is, and frankly, it's enormously expensive and time consuming to conserve large quantities of waterlogged wood. And not something within the purview of this project. Doesn't mean it couldn't happen at some point, but I don't foresee that as a big possibility. In this case, just reburial will ensure that the vessel remains are in that excellent preservative environment and also protected from further intrusions.
And I think part of our roles as stewards of this site and folks that have been working with it most recently too, doing sort of public presentations like this so that we can help make more of the public stewards for this site and understand how important it is to take care of this place and, you know, make sure that we're all protecting it.
Absolutely.
Great, thanks, guys. Kind of relatedly, someone is wondering if you can define what row galley as a ship type means and what the history of that is.
Short answer, no. Long answer, also no. So I think that as I mentioned in the one of my two presentations today, it's a very malleable term, certainly in the 18th and early 19th centuries. They tend to be long, narrow ships, relatively speaking, to a more traditional sailing vessel like the schooner, maybe even like the Royal Savage. We tend to think of vessels, small sailing vessels like schooners or sloops, as of having a 3-to-1 length to beam ratio. So a boat is typically 3 times longer than it is wide. That's a very, generalized rule of thumb. But and in the case of the row galleys, it's more like 4-to-1. They're narrower and longer than your average sailing ship. They also were all equipped with row ports, oar ports, so that they could be rowed. Though they had these, at least in the case of the Congress, it was, had this lateen rig on 2 masts, which made it probably a considerably better sailor than the square rigged gunboats. They still undoubtedly spent a large amount of their time under power with oars, which provides a whole nother level of mobility, even against the wind, that you don't have with a boat that's not equipped that way. So I assume that's where the row part of the row galley comes from. The long, narrow nature of these boats and the lateen rig is reflective of boat building traditions from the Mediterranean, which were still using oared craft, certainly well into the 17th century. And early 18th century. So that's kind of where the origin comes from. But it is, like I said, a very malleable term. When we look at where the shipbuilding team that built the Congress came from, down in Philadelphia, where Paul is, they had worked on some vessels there for the Pennsylvania Navy that they also termed row galleys. But when they describe them, they sound much more like the gunboats that we have here on Lake Champlain. And then later, by the War of 1812, what we have on Lake Champlain as part of the American fleet are what they call row galleys, but they're much more like the gunboats as well. And they just have a single gun. Well, actually, they have one gun at either end. So it's really all vessel terminology in the 18th century is very squishy, and with row galleys, it seems to be even more so. So it's certainly an area that I intend to spend a lot more time digging into and thinking about, but it's pretty frustrating right now to try to nail that down precisely.
Is it true too that this is like the only known row galley?
Absolutely, yeah. Certainly of the Lake Champlain squadron, this is the only archaeological remains we have of one of these row galleys at the present. Who knows? Another one might be found, or maybe it already was. I don't know. It's the only other real evidence we have are those contemporaneous paintings, which are pretty crude, and then that wonderful lines drawing of the row galley Washington from the Royal Navy when they took that into their possession.
And so, as a follow-up question, it sounds like there is a lot of variation in what these boats could be, but the ones that you're specifically looking at in this context, about how many people could fit on each of them?
Sure, I believe that the Congress and the other rogue galleys in the American fleet had a crew of about 75 crew members.
Great, thank you.
Was that to like the 50 on gunboats?
Gunboats
About
was 45,
45?
somewhere around in there. And there were, as we saw with the sinking of the Philadelphia, when the Philadelphia was sinking, the crew of the Philadelphia escaped onto the Washington,
Right.
which was then captured. Though the crew of the Philadelphia that was on the Washington were like, we don't want to get captured, and they jumped into a bateau and rowed ashore all by themselves. So those crew numbers were,
They changed.
yeah, that was the allotment of people that were supposed to be on that boat, but they moved around quite a bit from what we can see in the historic record.
Right, kind of going off of the terminology question, there are some discussions of different terms for boats happening in the Q&A. The term bateau, is that still used to describe these gunboats? Are they interchangeable? What's kind of the preferred terminology there?
Oh, that's a tough one. I mean, a bateau in the Lake Champlain context is a relatively small cargo vessel. It's basically just a big open rowboat, sometimes equipped with a sail, sometimes not. Typically double-ended, meaning they were pointed on both ends. And they could carry, I believe, in the order of about 10 tons of cargo when fully laden, or a couple of dozen soldiers if needs be. And they all different sizes, so these are very much generalizations. I think we could look at the design of the gunboat, like the Philadelphia or the Spitfire, the gondolas, as they were sometimes referred to, as kind of an expanded bateau design. They're flat-bottomed like bateau. They're just longer. We had a replica bateau here that was a replica of a French and Indian War era bateau, and it was about 32 feet long, and that's pretty big for a bateau in this area, where the gunboats are more like 54 feet long. So it's kind of like an expanded bateau with a mast and guns. So that's a pretty generalized answer, but the design is similar, but they were not referred to as bateau. They were referred to as gondolas or gunboats.
Right. So I'd like to just circle back to some of the questions that people have been patiently waiting to have answered about the battle itself. There's several questions here, so we can try to get to all of them. First of all, someone is wondering, were any British boats sunk and found in this battle?
Excuse me. One British gunboat was sunk when its own gun burst. Perhaps it was hit by an American round, but the gun burst and that boat broke apart and presumably sank, though it has not been found. It's been looked for, but it has not been found. Other than that, no British vessels were lost during the Battle of Valcour Island or the run and gun battle that led up to Arnold's Bay. One of their really large boats, the Thunderer, which was it was referred to as a radeau, it's kind of a floating gun battery, was later wrecked after the events at Arnold's Bay in the northern part of Lake Champlain, but no extensive remains of that vessel have been found either, unfortunately.
Right. And a couple of questions that people have about the land portion of the battle in Ferris Bay. Someone is asking if the American defensive position on the bluff above Ferris Bay was attacked by the British ships in spite of its elevation.
Well, from the historic documents, we know that there was an order to create an American defensive line. It's not something that we were able to find from our sampling study, but we would imagine that there was firing back and forth. I mean, that's what's in a lot of historic documents. I couldn't tell you if they hit or missed, but we saw some shot scatter for sure into the bay. So, it's one of those things where it's like you have this amount of data, and then what sort of narrative can you construct from there?
Yeah, the historic documentation tells us that the British fleet anchored kind of at the mouth of the bay, and one of the reasons they stayed out that far is because some of their vessels were much larger and had much deeper draft. They needed more water to float in, and they were afraid that if they went into Arnold's Bay, they would have gotten stuck. which may be the reason that Arnold chose to go to Ferris's Bay at the time, because he knew the British couldn't follow him all the way in. And then we have this defensive line at the top of the bluff. I don't know how much shooting they did, but I'm sure the British were shooting at them and at the other people escaping from the boats, and apparently even at the Ferris's homestead. So we
My
did find
understanding of that line of defense too, from what I've read, other people interpret it as like they were there to make sure that the British didn't come in and try to salvage the boats before they were burned enough to not be salvageable. So, you know, it could mean that they were just, you know, waiting for other bateaus, the guys going to come through like closer to try and put the fires out, sort of thing. Like we really don't
I think
know
that's right,
more
yeah.
details than those documents. And
It's literally one line in one.
yeah.
report.
So people
they
have different
informed them as well,
interpretations
yeah.
of it, and I encourage people to look for those documents. I think those are in the NDAR. What is it? Naval documents of the
of the American Revolution, which
Thank
is a huge multi-volume series of documents from the
yeah, I
American
think you have
Revolution.
one on your case right
Yeah.
behind you there too.
Yeah, there.
But that's all available
All
online.
those books.
You don't need a membership or anything anywhere. You can just like search them and find PDFs of all these and read through some of the documents. Really cool.
Right, and kind of relatedly, someone is asking about whether the Ferris family was able to return to their farm after the war.
Oh, they have
Yeah.
such an interesting
It's
history.
a complicated story. They returned after this. They found that their farm had been destroyed. They rebuilt it. Later in the war, the British were passing through with a cavalry unit and stationed 200 horses in their farm fields and wrecked their farm fields once again. Ultimately, the Ferrises, or Peter Ferris and Squire Ferris, the father and son portion of the family, were picked up as collaborators with the colonial forces and actually spent a couple of years in British prison camps, actually on a
Were they in Quebec?
prison hulk. I think they were down in New York, but I'm honestly not 100% sure on that.
Eventually,
So-
they ended up.
I have to look it up again.
Yeah, they did end up going back after the war and rebuilding, but there's actually some suggestion that they raised one of the gunboats while they were still living on the shores of the bay, and may have used it as possibly a ferry or as some sort of transportation device. But again, we have one report of
One
that
line of
happening,
the yeah. Again, it's like
very
these
clear.
newspaper articles that you can find sometimes they run away with truth too. You never know. You just collect as much as you can, I guess.
Right, thanks. We also have some people asking about the material and the construction of these boats. So the first question is about the types of wood. Did you expect to find a widely varied collection of wood species in the construction of these vessels, as seems to be common in other vessels built in the area at this time? What are these boats made out of? Are they all made of oak or birch, or are the masts different than other parts of the boat? What's kind of the composition that you're talking?
Like I said during my presentation, unfortunately, we haven't recovered wood samples from our current excavations, but my expectation is that the frames and the keelson, the main structural elements of the vessel are made out of white oak, and the hull planking, masts, and things of that nature would have been made out of white pine predominantly. We'll have to wait and see what the results of our wood typology show us once we're able to collect those samples and get them tested. Certainly, whoever wrote that question is correct. Some of the other vessels we see in this area have really weird types of wood that used in their construction, particularly in the War of 1812 vessels, which they built even faster than the Revolutionary War vessels. And they must have just been grabbing whatever they had. You know, you'll see weird things like elm and stuff like that in ship construction. That's not something you usually use for these type of vessels. So I'm assuming it's going to be predominantly oak and white pine, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Right. And kind of as a follow-up to this, people are wondering how this research has contributed to our understanding of the history of ship construction at Skenesborough and Whitehall.
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, it certainly, I think, reinforces the idea, and particularly in that variability in the dimensions of the timbers that were used. It definitely reinforces the idea that they were using whatever they could get their hands on, as far as, in this case, I think it's oak, of whatever dimension they could, as long as they could carve it down, which then again points to kind of the rush nature of the operation. And they were really building these boats to last for one battle, and that's what they did. Other than that, I don't know that it adds a huge amount to our understanding. Well, no, I take that back. If we look at that open framing pattern of the vessels, that gives us some idea of the sequence of the construction of the boat that we may not have had in the past. Because with those disarticulated frames, you would actually establish the made frames, those ones where the components are actually fastened together first. And then you might start planking on those made frames, and then you'd start filling in those other floors and futtocks as the planking continued around the outside of the hull. So that gives us some insight into the construction process at Whitehall. But other than that, doesn't give us a great insight into what the shipbuilders' life was like or anything of that nature. So
I do like that avenue of research, though, because we've talked about that quite a few times, of like trying to look further into the groups of people that they brought to Skenesborough to build these boats.
yes,
And if there's any, I mean, we haven't done documentary research into those groups that far,
No.
right?
Well,
And so
specifically with the
interesting.
row galleys, right? We have
Yeah.
three known examples. The one was built, the Congress was built by this group from Philadelphia. I'm going to forget which one here, but the Washington or the Trumbull was built by, there was another shipbuilding team from Connecticut and another shipbuilding team from what they call Massachusetts, but I think they really mean Maine, because it was all part of Massachusetts at the time. They each built one of the row galleys. So it would be fascinating if we had more examples, of course, to see what differences were identifiable between these boats, but sadly.
Yeah, I have read somewhere that, I mean, the 4 gunboats that were there, or Providence, New Haven, Boston, what's the last one?
Connecticut.
Connecticut. So I read somewhere, and it might have been in Bellico's book, that they were named for the folks that were building them.
Oh, that's interesting.
The
Yeah, that's
gunboats.
interesting.
And I'm trying to remember exactly. It's probably a Bellico reference.
So what about the Spitfire?
I don't know. Well, maybe they have diaries
honestly, the Spitfire name. The Spitfire name is a weird anomaly. All the other ones are named after people or places, and then you have the Spitfire, which is a very British name, and just kind of an odd duck in this fleet.
Maybe we'll find a shipwright's diary somewhere. Give us a bunch of answers.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Thanks, guys. We have a couple of questions that are kind of related to one another, kind of related to artillery and arms. So our first question asker says, Henry Knox removed considerable artillery from Fort Ticonderoga for the siege of Boston. For Arnold's fleet vessels that were equipped there, what were the sources of their artillery?
No, this would be a good one to refer to our friends at Fort Ticonderoga.
Yeah.
I'm pretty confident that the amount of artillery that was housed at Fort Ticonderoga was extraordinary for the size of the fortification. And that is all a remnant, or not all, but mostly a remnant of the absolutely epic sized battles that took place around Ticonderoga during the French and Indian War. So I think that Henry Knox certainly took a good percentage of the guns from the fort, but he didn't take everything. So there were still some guns around there. I know that they were also harvesting cannon tubes from the remains of the fort at Crown Point, which is 10 miles north of Fort Ticonderoga, right at the very narrowest part of the lake where there actually is a bridge now. There were a number of guns that were dug out. That fort was damaged by a gunpowder explosion between the French Indian War and the American Revolution, and kind of abandoned. But they were collecting gun tubes from those locations and recycling them. So many of these guns were probably quite old, even at the time of the American Revolution, and had, in some cases, had a pretty hard life up to that point, and a lot of environmental exposure.
Right, kind of keeping on this track, someone is wondering what it would have looked like when the cannons were being fired on one of these boats. They say, I would imagine only 1 or 2 cannons could be fired at the same time, as the recoil would be tremendous. But what did that actually look like?
Yeah, I mean, each of these guns would have been mounted on a naval carriage, which is a small gun carriage with, probably 4 wheels that are 9 to 12 inches in diameter. And they would be fastened to the side of the vessel. This is of the row galleys. They would be fastened to the side of the vessel by tackle, ropes, and lines so when the gun was fired, it would jump backwards quite a distance. Then the gun tackle would allow you to pull the gun back into firing position once you've loaded it and prepared it to fire again. So it was a very dangerous place to be. You didn't want to stand behind the gun when you fired it, that's for sure, because they would jump backwards several feet each time they were fired. I don't know how often a vessel like the Congress was actually firing a broadside, where it tried to fire all of the guns on one side of the boat at once. Particularly with the American gun crews on these vessels were perhaps not the most well-trained gun crews that you might have on a naval vessel, since most of them were actually, militiamen and land soldiers. They weren't sailors to begin with. But larger warships were designed to absorb that kind of recoil without, so they could fire their entire broadsides, which sometimes would be 50 guns on one side for some of the largest naval vessels of the 18th century. So a lot of noise, a lot of smoke, and a lot of heavy metal moving around at high rates of speed. It would have been a dangerous place to be, for sure.
Yeah, the boats are pretty packed with people
Lots of
too.
people.
So I imagine
Lots
that
of
took
people.
some orchestration. You definitely hear accounts of people dying from just getting hit with the gun coming back. So,
Yes.
I mean, just imagine the chaos, right? It's pretty intense.
For sure. And to kind of round out our cannon questions for the moment, someone is wondering what happened to all of the cannon when the boats were scuttled, if the museum has any, or where they might have ended up.
Paul, you want to touch on that one?
Yeah. As I mentioned in my presentation, when the aftermath of the escape from Belcourt Bay and the defense of the fleet at Ferris's Bay concluded from 1776 to 1777, there are accounts of the British salvaging cannon from the remains of the Congress and the gunboats in Ferris's Bay to be used as ballast. Who knows what the condition of the cannons were like at the time, but if they weren't in usable condition, they make really great weight for ballast for vessels. And we do see that in the historic record. Sometimes these big, heavy, clumps of metal are just thrown at the bottom of the vessel to help rate it. And then there are other accounts that we had found through primary sources like newspapers, where people did go and find things like the 18-pound cannon, Long John, that was recovered sometime in the late 19th century, and then carted from Vergennes all the way up to Burlington and displayed up there. That I'm not exactly sure. I'm not sure what the fate of that cannon is.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'd like to poke around on some more.
And then, of course, there's Mr. Bill Huber in 1934, who used his own kind of homemade diving apparatus to dive into Arnold's Bay as he was on vacation at Basin Harbor Club, and he found a cannon. He found a cannon and put it on his front lawn, basically. Or is that Basin Harbor Club?
Well, that's where he put it on display, was at his house that's either on the club or adjacent to Basin Harbor Resort, which is right next to us. that cannon is now on display in the Key to Liberty exhibit here at the Maritime Museum. So that is the one gun from Arnold's Bay that we have on display here at the Maritime Museum. It's a
And
small 4-pound cannon.
I think it's important to note that, you know, these pre and then post depositional salvage activities that occurred, you know, reclamation, whatever term you want to give them, you know, according to theoretical principles, we don't have a clear account of like what happened. Sometimes there are accounts through like salvage yards or ship graveyards where you know when a vessel was abandoned there and then when it was cut down and ultimately salvaged until the point where it just sank and there's nothing left to salvage unless you went in the water and raised it again. So it makes the historic record blurry. It really blurs the lines of like what was taken out when, aside from the records that we do have an understanding of. And unfortunately, that's one of the mysteries that we encounter as archaeologists. Sometimes we don't have the full, you know, all the answers to the questions that are asked.
In fact,
we still
rarely do we have.
Yeah,
all the
rarely.
answers.
But we do still have local folks that have family collections that will share that with us, and we get to learn so much more. You know, this was such a common practice at certain points in our history. It's just wonderful that when people do come out and share some of these materials that they have, because we get to, then we have more of a comparative collection, right? Then we have a even like bigger lot of information. So we always encourage folks to reach out if they have any, you know, other materials that we could see. You know, it just helps our research so much more.
For sure. Kind of on the topic of your study of the site and your research that's ongoing, a couple of people are curious about kind of what you're doing and why you do certain things. So one person is wondering why or when you're in Arnold's Bay doing your site work, why you would or wouldn't put up signage saying that there's a study happening, kind of how you treat the area and when you're working in it.
We don't necessarily advertise what we're doing while we're doing it, for I think fairly obvious reasons that we don't want to attract too much attention to the site, particularly when it's opened up and people might be able to access it inappropriately. But at the same time, if people ask, I'm happy to tell them about what we're doing and why we're doing it and why it's important that it be done properly. And so I don't know if that answers the question, but that's our basic modus operandi. We're not you know, we're not out there actively encouraging people to come visit us at the site, but there is a boat launch right there at Arnold's Bay. It's a pretty, and that's very active. A lot of people come down there and swim in Arnold's Bay during the summer when we're working, and we're always happy to chat with people. But certainly site security is something that we think about a lot. And
Yeah,
again,
and I
we're
think,
relying on the burial of the site to really be a large percentage of its protection.
And I think someone else had asked, I might have fielded that question in the group chat during someone else's presentation, but you know, that the boat launch is public, but the rest of the bay is private land. So you really shouldn't be like over there. It's private property and it's posted.
Yeah.
But
and,
yeah.
And the bottomlands are considered property of the state of Vermont. So that's why we had to have permitting from them to do the metal detecting around the Congress site. And the Congress site itself falls under the protection of the US Navy, and that's why we had a separate permitting situation with the hull remains of the Congress itself.
Right. And it's not so much that we're not trying to talk to the public. I mean, this is generally the venue that we prefer to be able to talk to people in, especially because when we're on site, we are working and we are using heavy equipment and machinery. And, you know, it's hard to also have a public facing sort of people when you're doing that kind of work. I mean, we've got divers in the water and we're cycling them in and out. And
those dredges just
trying to stay
droning in the
alive.
background. You know?
It's very loud.
It's very loud.
Too.
So kind of on that train of thought, how are the best ways for people to kind of stay informed and in the loop and hear about what kind of work you're doing in the lake and outside of it if they want to kind of stay abreast of the news?
Yeah, interact with our social medias, please. Reach out to us. We've got a great website. Send us emails. We field questions all the time for people. We love hearing from the public. You guys are great.
Yeah, we definitely have a pretty strong social media presence that keeps folks updated, not only on what we're doing, but all the other amazing things that go on at the Maritime Museum, including our rowing programs and our boat building programs, summer camps, all of those amazing things. There's an active blog on the museum's website that, you know, has slightly more depth to the articles than you might get from Facebook or Instagram or whatever the case may be, social media wise. The website itself is packed full of useful information. So all those typical kind of contact points. And of course, yeah, give us a call. We're always happy to. It's obvious that we don't mind talking about this stuff for hours on end. So please give us a call. We'll talk about it some more.
Awesome. And yeah, just being mindful of the time, it looks like we're about running out of time for our planned Q&A session. I see that there are some questions remaining, and I apologize if we weren't able to get to yours, but please feel free to send us an email. Like we said, we would be more than happy to be in touch with you and try to answer.
Maybe we can email people.
Sorry?
Can we save the chat? So maybe we can reach out to folks.
I think we should be able to do that. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
And if you think of anything after the conference, again, feel free to be in touch with us. But thank you so much for joining us today for this conference. I think we all super appreciate having the chance to share with the public. And thank you to our amazing panelists today for sharing what you guys have been working on. Yeah, special thank you also to our members who make it possible for us to do things like this. We're
Don't
very
forget your
appreciative.
ornament. You want
Yeah.
to get a membership and get this cool ornament.
Yeah, please, if you'd like to learn more about it, you can visit our website. And yeah, thank you again for all of your support.
Thank you, everybody. It's great presentations. Thanks a lot. And we'll hope to see you next year.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks,